There is a 12 by 8-inch mark on the back of an 18-year-old skull, and to this day, nobody actually agrees on what put it there. Not the coroner, who signed the first report. Not the forensic pathologist who examined the body a second time, 11 days later, after the tide and the heat had already started erasing evidence. Not the mother who has now buried her only son and been investigated by her own nursing board for talking about it in public. Nobody agrees because the honest answer is that nobody knows. And that sentence, nobody knows, is going to matter more in the next hour than almost anything anyone has shouted online since the 4th of July. This is the case of Nolan Wells. You have probably seen a clip. You have probably already picked a side. You have probably seen a theory. What you may not have seen is the actual paper trail, the parts that are confirmed on the record versus the parts that are just loud. Before we get into any of it, one thing needs to be said clearly because it is going to be the spine of everything that follows. There is a difference between what has been proven and what has been alleged, and that difference is where most coverage of this case, including a lot of what you have already watched, quietly falls apart. If you want more of this, the kind of coverage that separates the confirmed from the alleged instead of just chasing the loudest clip, the kind that would rather lose an audience than mislead one, go ahead and subscribe to this channel now because we are about to walk through 4 cases, not one, and the connections between them are not the ones you have already heard. Stay with this one all the way through. The ending is not what either side of this argument is expecting, and it is not going to hand you the villain you came here looking for, because the honest version of this story never had one to give you in the first place, only a body, a bone that never made it to the right table, and a family still waiting. Start with what is not in dispute, because before any of the medicine, before any of the theories, there is a plain sequence of hours that everyone, on every side of this case, agrees actually happened. Nolan Xavier Wells was 18 years old, from Mississippi, days removed from starting the next chapter of his life. He was, by every account from people who knew him, the kind of kid adults describe using words like promising and grounded, a young man with real opportunities ahead of him and a family that by all appearances loved him without complication. On the morning of July 4th, 2026, a boat left the mainland at 9:56 a.m. carrying Wells and a group of friends, headed out for a holiday on the water the way thousands of families along that stretch of coast do every summer. The boat arrived at Horn Island, a barrier island off the Mississippi Gulf Coast, reachable only by private vessel, uninhabited apart from the wildlife and the occasional research station, at 11:14 a.m. There is video of Wells on the island at 2:23 p.m. That is the last confirmed visual record of him alive. Horn Island itself is worth understanding for a moment, because its physical character shapes almost every theory anyone has ever proposed about that afternoon. It is a genuinely remote place, a narrow, undeveloped barrier island roughly 12 miles off the Mississippi coastline, part of the Gulf Islands National Seashore, with no permanent residents, no commercial development, no cell towers standing close enough to guarantee reliable signal across its full length, and no law enforcement or lifeguard presence beyond the occasional Park Service patrol. Getting there requires a private boat, and a level of planning most casual beach trips do not. For generations, it has been the kind of place Gulf Coast families go specifically because it is undeveloped, quiet, and largely free of the crowds that pack the mainland beaches on a holiday weekend. That same remoteness that makes it appealing for 4th of July outing is exactly what makes this case so difficult to investigate. There was no boardwalk camera, no lifeguard stand with a sight line down the beach. No other families camped close enough to overhear an argument or notice someone walking off alone. Whatever happened in the missing 2 hours happened in a place built, almost by design, to leave no independent record of it. That same remoteness shaped the earliest hours of the search once Wells was reported missing, a detail that matters for understanding why nearly 2 full days passed before his body was recovered. A search across an undeveloped barrier island, much of it dense brush and shoreline stretching for miles, accessible only by boat and largely without cell coverage to coordinate in real time, is a fundamentally slower, harder undertaking than a search in a populated area with roads, cameras, and cell tower pings to narrow the search radius. None of that explains away the 2-hour gap in the timeline itself, which occurred while Wells' friends were still on the island with him, well before any search operation began. But it does explain a separate, adjacent question that has also generated its own share of speculation. Why the interval between his disappearance being reported and his body being found stretched across roughly a day and a half, a delay that reflects the genuine physical difficulty of searching that specific terrain rather than, on the currently available evidence, any documented failure of the search effort itself. The friends' boat left the island at 4:31 p.m. and was back on the mainland by 6:06 p.m., sometime around 11 p.m. that night. One of the friends called Wells' parents. His parents reported him missing that night. For nearly 2 days, his family did not know whether he was alive somewhere on that island, injured somewhere in the water, or already gone. His body was found on the island's shoreline on July 6th by a United States Park Service ranger conducting a routine patrol. Read that timeline again, slowly, because almost every theory circulating about this case is trying to fill in the 2 hours and 8 minutes between 2:23 and 4:31. That gap is real. It is not manufactured by conspiracy channels, and it is not manufactured by defenders of the friends who were present that day either. It is a confirmed, documented gap in the visual record, and it is the single most important fact in this entire story because it is the only fact that every competing version of events has to somehow account for. Whatever actually happened on that island happened entirely inside a window nobody outside of the people physically present that afternoon can currently verify, one way or the other. Before we go further into what the medicine says, it helps to actually understand what medicine is capable of saying in a case like this at all, because almost none of the loudest commentary about this case bothers to explain the underlying science before it starts arguing about the conclusions. So, let's slow down and build that foundation first, because everything that follows depends on it. When a person drowns while they are still alive, meaning they are conscious, breathing, and their heart is still beating when water enters their airway, a specific and well-documented physiological sequence tends to unfold. Water reaching the lungs at a cellular level, down at the alveolar tissue, where oxygen actually crosses into the bloodstream, is one of the clearest markers separating a live drowning from a body that entered the water after death had already occurred. If a person is alive and inhaling when they go under, forensic examiners typically find water, along with whatever was present in that water, algae, sediment, bacteria specific to the environment, deep in the lung tissue itself. If a person was already deceased before entering the water, that pattern is markedly different because a body that is no longer breathing cannot actively draw water down into the lower respiratory tract the way a living, straining body does. You might find small amounts of water in the mouth or throat from passive settling, but not the same volume, not the same depth of penetration, not the same signature. It is worth stating the broader context plainly before going any further, because it grounds this specific case inside a much larger, less sensational reality that rarely gets mentioned in coverage built around suspicion. Drowning is, unremarkably and tragically, one of the leading causes of accidental death among teenagers and young adults in the United States every single year, spiking predictably around holiday weekends on open water, exactly the setting this case unfolded in. The overwhelming majority of those deaths involve no other person's wrongdoing at all, simply the genuine, well-documented dangers of open water, currents, fatigue, and the split-second nature of how quickly a swimmer in distress can go under without anyone nearby immediately realizing what is happening. That base rate does not resolve anything about this specific case, and it should not be used to wave away the specific, documented gaps in the record that make this case different from an ordinary accidental drowning. But it is worth holding in mind as a counterweight to the instinct, understandable as it is, to treat every unexplained drowning as inherently more suspicious than the statistics around ordinary water accidents actually suggest it should be. There is one more investigative tool worth understanding before we move further into this case, because it is frequently overlooked in casual discussion of contested deaths, and it directly touches on the 6-day gap that shaped everything Dr. Mitchell was and was not able to determine. Forensic entomology, the study of insect activity on a body, can help investigators estimate a post-mortem interval, roughly how long a body has been exposed to the environment, based on which insect species have colonized it and at what stage of their life cycle they are found. Different insect species arrive at a body in a predictable succession, drawn by decomposition at different stages, and an entomologist trained to read that succession can sometimes narrow a window of time since death with real precision, particularly useful in cases where the exact time of death is otherwise unclear. This kind of evidence is time-sensitive in the same way tissue-based evidence is. Insect activity patterns shift and become harder to interpret the longer a scene goes unexamined, and it is unclear from the public record whether this technique was applied in Wells' case at all. It is included here not because it changes anything specific about what is currently known, but because it is one more example of the broader theme running through this entire hour. Forensic science has an impressive toolkit for reading a body accurately, and nearly every tool in that kit works best in the first hours and days after death, a window that, in this case, as in the others, had already begun closing before independent experts were given the chance to use it. There are other markers examiners look for as well. Petechial hemorrhaging, small ruptured blood vessels around the eyes, can appear as a result of the physical strain of holding one's breath and struggling against submersion, the pressure inside the body rising as a person fights to keep from inhaling water for as long as they physically can. In many but not all cases, a foam can form in the airway as proteins in the lungs break down under the stress of the process, though the absence of that foam does not rule drowning out, because it is not present in every case. None of this is exotic science. It is well-established, decades-old forensic pathology, taught in every medical examiner training program in the country. The reason it matters here is that it draws a sharp line between two very different categories of death, a line that later evidence can sometimes blur when time and decomposition are allowed to intervene before anyone gets a proper look. There's a related concept worth explaining as well, because it comes up constantly in cases where a body shows no obvious external trauma but still raises questions about how someone died. Positional asphyxia, sometimes discussed alongside mechanical asphyxia more broadly. This refers to a death in which a person's body position, rather than any external force applied by another person, restricts their ability to breathe adequately, cutting off oxygen gradually until it proves fatal. It is a real, medically recognized cause of death, documented in cases ranging from restraint situations to accidental entrapment, and it is exactly the theory the state originally advanced in the Kendrick Johnson case. It is also, notably, a genuinely difficult category of death to prove or disprove definitively through autopsy alone, because unlike a fracture or a laceration, it often leaves comparatively little unambiguous physical evidence behind, especially once decomposition has begun. That evidentiary thinness is precisely why positional asphyxia theories tend to generate the exact kind of prolonged, unresolved public dispute we have seen in the Johnson case, and why a similarly ambiguous, low physical evidence finding in the Wells case, an internal discoloration with an unclear cause rather than a clean fracture or wound, is following a comparable trajectory toward a similarly unsatisfying, evidence-limited conclusion. And that is exactly the fork this case sits on. A first autopsy was conducted by the Jackson County Coroner's Office in coordination with the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office. That office reported no obvious signs of physical injury and treated the death as a probable drowning. The Jackson County Sheriff's Office publicly stated it did not suspect foul play. That was the official position for several days, communicated with the kind of institutional confidence that, in most cases involving accidental deaths on the water, would have been the entire story. A young man went out on a boat, wandered off from his friends at some point during the afternoon, and drowned. Tragic, but not sinister. That was the frame. It stopped being the only frame the moment the family, through attorney Ben Crump, commissioned a second, independent autopsy. And this is where the case actually becomes a case about forensic science, not just a case about a missing window of time on a beach. Before we get to what that second autopsy found, it is worth pausing on something rarely discussed directly in coverage of cases like this one: the sheer cost and access barrier baked into the entire concept of an independent second opinion. A family-commissioned autopsy is not free. It requires locating and retaining a qualified, credentialed forensic pathologist, often traveling from another state, arranging transport of the body or its relevant components, and covering fees that can run into the tens of thousands of dollars depending on the scope of the examination. Most families facing a sudden, unexplained death do not have that kind of money sitting available, and most families do not have a nationally prominent civil rights attorney willing to underwrite or arrange that cost as part of a broader legal effort. The Wells family had access to exactly that kind of support. The Johnson family eventually secured similar backing years into their fight. Countless other families, in far less publicized cases, simply never get the chance to challenge an official ruling they do not believe, not because their case is less deserving of scrutiny, but because they cannot afford the version of scrutiny this case is receiving. That is not a criticism of the Wells family for accessing the resources available to them. They would be foolish not to. It is a broader, structural observation about who actually gets a second opinion in America when the first one does not add up, and it is a quieter injustice sitting underneath the louder one this entire case is organized around. The man who performed that second autopsy is not a random hired gun, and it matters enormously that you know exactly who he is before you weigh what he found, because credibility is not a footnote in a case like this. It is load-bearing. Dr. Roger A. Mitchell Jr. is a board-certified forensic pathologist. He is the president of Howard University Hospital. He is the former chief medical examiner for the District of Columbia, a jurisdiction where he was personally responsible for overseeing death investigations across the entire capital of the United States, a role that means signing off on the official cause and manner of death in politically sensitive, high-scrutiny cases as a matter of routine, not exception. He has testified before Congress specifically on forensic pathology standards and law enforcement-involved deaths. He has published peer-reviewed research on death investigation methodology. When people on either side of this case try to wave away his findings as activism dressed up as medicine, that resume is the inconvenient fact they have to get around first. Credentials are not proof of correctness. Nobody's credentials, on any side of any case, are proof of correctness. But they are proof that dismissing his findings casually the way a lot of commentary has is intellectually lazy, and we are not going to do that here. It is worth understanding, briefly, what board certification in forensic pathology actually requires, because the phrase gets used constantly without much explanation of what stands behind it. It begins with a full medical degree, followed by a residency in anatomic and clinical pathology, typically several years long, followed by an additional fellowship year specifically in forensic pathology, followed by a rigorous certifying examination administered by the American Board of Pathology. Only physicians who complete that entire sequence and who continue meeting ongoing certification requirements throughout their career can call themselves board-certified forensic pathologists. It is a narrow, demanding specialty, and the number of board-certified forensic pathologists actively practicing in the United States is, relative to the country's population and the volume of deaths requiring investigation each year, genuinely small, a shortage that medical examiner offices around the country have publicly flagged as a systemic staffing problem for years. That shortage matters here too, quietly, because it is part of why family commissions second opinions, in a case like this one, in the Johnson case, in countless others, so often have to bring in an outside expert from another city or another state entirely, rather than simply finding a second qualified pathologist locally. The same scarcity that makes Dr. Mitchell's specific credentials so significant is also a structural pressure point in how forensic disputes like this one unfold everywhere in the country, not just in Mississippi. Mitchell received the body on July 10th. Sit with that date for a second and do the arithmetic alongside us. Wells was last seen alive on July 4th. His body was recovered on July 6th. Mitchell's examination did not begin until July 10th, 4 days after recovery and 6 full days after anyone last confirmed him alive. In the Mississippi Gulf Coast in July, with average temperatures well into the 90s and humidity that accelerates decomposition dramatically compared to cooler climates, 6 days is not a small delay. It is an enormous one, and it is the single biggest limiting factor on everything that follows, a fact we are going to keep returning to because it explains almost every frustrating gap in what this case has been able to establish with certainty. His preliminary findings were made public on July 22nd at the NAACP's National Convention, where Ben Crump announced them alongside the family, in front of a room and a nation already primed for a dramatic revelation. Here is what Mitchell actually found, stated plainly, without embellishment in either direction, because the gap between what he actually said and what got repeated afterward is one of the most important gaps in this entire story. He documented a 12 by 8 inch area of discoloration in the deep soft tissue over the occipital region, the back of the skull. He was explicit on the record that there was no skull fracture and no laceration of the skin. The discoloration was internal, beneath the surface, not a visible wound, not a cut, not a break. Its cause, in his own characterization, was unclear. He also documented something that sounds almost bureaucratic on paper, but turns out to be the emotional center of gravity for the entire public reaction to this case. Several structures from the neck, the trachea, the laryngeal cartilage, the thyroid horn, and the hyoid bone were not sent to him with the body. He could not examine them because they were not there to examine. This is exactly the point in the story where most coverage jumps straight to outrage, and we're going to slow down instead because slowing down here is the entire point of doing this differently than everyone else has. The hyoid bone is a small, U-shaped bone that sits in the neck, unattached to any other bone in the body, suspended entirely by muscle and ligament. It is one of the first things a forensic pathologist checks when strangulation or neck compression is even a remote possibility, because a fractured or dislocated hyoid is one of the more reliable physical indicators of manual or ligature strangulation. If you have watched any crime documentary in the last decade, you have probably heard a pathologist say some version of "we checked the hyoid" as shorthand for "we ruled out strangulation." So when the public heard that the hyoid bone, along with the rest of the throat structures, was missing from the second autopsy, the instinct was immediate, visceral, and understandable. That sounds like evidence was hidden. That sounds like someone did not want a second pair of eyes looking at the one thing that could have answered the hardest question this case raises. Here is the part a responsible retelling of this case has to include, even though it complicates the clean narrative, because complicating the clean narrative is the entire job. Retaining neck structures during an initial autopsy, specifically when there is any possibility that strangulation or neck trauma needs closer forensic study, is a recognized and defensible practice in forensic pathology. Pathologists sometimes retain those structures precisely so they can be studied more carefully, decalcified, sectioned, examined under conditions a field autopsy does not always allow. It is not, by itself, evidence of a cover-up. Dr. Mitchell himself, in his own public statements, characterized this as something the original Mississippi pathologist likely did deliberately, as part of standard practice when neck injury is a live question, not as something he was alleging was done to sabotage his own examination. That is a critical distinction, and it is one that a lot of viral commentary flattened into something far more sinister than what the forensic pathologist who actually did the work was saying himself, on the record, in his own voice. But, and this is the honest tension the case sits in, the tension we are not going to resolve for you, because it has not been resolved by anyone with the authority to resolve it. The effect of that retention, regardless of the intent behind it, was that the one structure most capable of definitively ruling in or ruling out neck trauma was unavailable to the doctor the family trusted to look for exactly that. Standard practice and convenient practice are not mutually exclusive categories. Something can be procedurally normal and still leave a gaping hole in what the public is able to know for certain. Both of those things are true at the same time, and any version of the story that only tells you one of them is not being straight with you. Hold that thought carefully. We're going to come back to it more than once, because it is the fulcrum this entire case actually balances on, whether anyone shouting about it online realizes that or not. Layer onto that the 6 days of decomposition before the body ever reached Dr. Mitchell. Cellular breakdown does not pause for grief or for legal timelines. It does not wait for a family to find the right attorney or for that attorney to arrange transport and clearance for an independent examiner. The moment a heart stops, the body's own chemistry begins working against every future examiner who will ever look at it. By the time of the second examination, the tissue itself had already begun losing the fine-grained information, surface bruising patterns, precise timing of injury relative to death, subtle signs of vital versus post-mortem trauma that a fresher examination could have captured cleanly. This is not a flaw specific to this case or to this medical examiner's office. It is a structural limitation of every second autopsy conducted after any meaningful delay, in any case, anywhere in the world. The first look at a body is almost always the most information-rich look a pathologist will ever get. Every day after that is a day of erosion, a slow, chemical dismantling of the evidence everyone is desperately trying to preserve. There is a related piece of forensic science worth explaining here too, because it comes up constantly in cases like this, and is almost never explained clearly on camera. Post-mortem lividity, sometimes called livor mortis, is the settling of blood within the body after the heart stops beating and can no longer circulate it. Gravity pulls blood downward, pooling it in whatever part of the body is lowest, and that pooling produces a purplish or reddish discoloration in the skin and underlying tissue that, to an untrained eye, can look strikingly similar to bruising from an injury. If a person's body has been lying on its back, blood settles toward the back of the head, the shoulders, the buttocks, the calves. A forensic pathologist examining that discoloration at a cellular level can typically distinguish lividity from an actual antemortem bruise, because a real bruise involves ruptured blood vessels and an inflammatory response that begins while a person is still alive, leaving a distinct cellular signature that simple gravitational pooling does not produce. But that distinction gets harder, not easier, the more decomposed the tissue is by the time someone looks at it. We are not telling you this to hand you a tidy explanation for the mark on the back of Nolan Wells' skull. Nobody, including Dr. Mitchell, has said with certainty that the discoloration he found was lividity rather than an actual injury, and it would be dishonest to imply otherwise. What we are telling you is that this is precisely the category of question decomposition makes harder to answer definitively, and it is precisely the category of question a fresher examination, conducted days earlier, would have had a much better chance of resolving cleanly. The honest state of the evidence is that the mark could be consistent with several different explanations, and 6 days of Gulf Coast heat took some of the tools that could have distinguished between them off the table before anyone with Mitchell's expertise ever got a chance to use them. Given all of that, the internal discoloration with no explained cause, the missing throat structures, the decomposition-limited window, Dr. Mitchell's official conclusion, the one that actually made it into his report rather than the one that made it into comment sections, was that the cause and manner of death were undetermined. Not homicide. Not accidental drowning. Confirmed and closed. Undetermined. As of the most recent public reporting, the official state ruling from the Mississippi Medical Examiner's Office also remains undetermined, with the district attorney, Angel Myers-McElrath, stating that findings will be presented to a grand jury before further details are released to the public. It is worth pausing here to explain what presented to a grand jury actually means in practical terms, because that phrase gets thrown around constantly in coverage of this case, as though it is a formality on the way to an inevitable answer, and it is not, no matter how many times a confident narrator says otherwise. A grand jury is not a trial. It does not determine guilt or innocence. Its narrow job is to review the evidence a prosecutor brings to it and decide whether that evidence is sufficient to support formal criminal charges against a specific person for a specific crime. If the evidence available, autopsy findings, witness statements, physical evidence from the scene, does not clearly point toward a chargeable crime committed by an identifiable person, a grand jury has no mechanism to manufacture that clarity out of an undetermined ruling. It can only work with what investigators hand it. It is worth being clear-eyed about how a grand jury actually receives a case like this one procedurally, because it is not simply handed a stack of autopsy reports and left to vote. A prosecutor decides which evidence to present, in what order, and with what framing, meaning the outcome depends not only on the underlying facts but on the specific case a district attorney's office chooses to build from them. That is not a suggestion of misconduct. It is simply how the grand jury system is designed to function everywhere in the country, prosecutorial discretion built directly into the process rather than layered on top of it. Understanding that helps explain why two cases with superficially similar underlying facts can produce very different grand jury outcomes, and why watching this specific process unfold will tell you as much about how Angel Myers-McElrath's office chooses to present the evidence as it will about the evidence itself. A distinction almost none of the commentary treating a grand jury referral as a guaranteed step toward indictment has bothered to make. There are, broadly, 3 ways this process can conclude, and it is worth naming all 3 plainly rather than letting the public imagination default to only the most dramatic one. A grand jury can return an indictment, formally charging a specific named individual with a specific crime, which then moves the case into an actual criminal trial where guilt or innocence would finally be argued and decided. A grand jury can decline to indict, sometimes called a no true bill, a legal outcome that is not the same thing as a declaration of innocence, only a determination that the evidence presented did not meet the threshold required to proceed to trial. Or, less dramatically, but perhaps most likely given the current state of the forensic evidence, prosecutors may determine, before ever formally presenting the case, that the evidence does not support bringing charges against any specific individual at all, closing the matter without a grand jury vote ever being taken on an indictment in the first place. Only one of those three outcomes produces the kind of clear, named accountability a large portion of this case's audience is currently expecting. The other two, statistically the more common outcomes in cases built on evidence this ambiguous, would leave the case functionally where Kendrick Johnson's has sat for 13 years now. It is worth being honest, plainly, about which of those three outcomes the current evidentiary record actually points toward. An undetermined cause and manner of death, a missing key structure, and a decomposition-limited examination window are not, on their own, the ingredients of a strong criminal case. They are the ingredients of exactly the kind of prolonged, unresolved ambiguity Kendrick Johnson's family has now lived inside for 13 years, and preparing for that possibility honestly, rather than being blindsided by it later, is a kinder thing to do for anyone genuinely invested in this case than promising and ending the evidence has not yet earned. If the underlying forensic picture remains as unresolved as it currently is, a grand jury is not going to resolve it through deliberation alone. It is going to reflect whatever the evidence actually supports, which, as of today, is not a confirmed homicide and not a confirmed accident. That is an uncomfortable thing to explain to a public that has been waiting months for an answer, but it is the truth about how this process actually works, and skipping past it, letting people believe a grand jury appearance guarantees resolution, sets everyone up for another wave of anger when the process does not deliver the certainty it was never actually built to deliver in a case this evidentially thin, anger that will land on institutions, on the family, and on the four uncharged friends alike, regardless of who actually deserves it. It is worth naming, too, the pattern this case fits into of independent forensic investigations being funded not by government budgets or insurance, but by individual public figures choosing to underwrite them directly. Colin Kaepernick's funding of the second autopsy sits inside a broader, increasingly visible phenomenon in which athletes, entertainers, and public figures step in to bankroll exactly the kind of independent scrutiny discussed a moment ago, the scrutiny most families cannot otherwise afford. That pattern is, in one sense, a genuine good, extending access to forensic resources that would otherwise be entirely out of reach for a working family in coastal Mississippi. It is also, in another sense, a quiet indictment of a system that requires private philanthropy to fill a gap the justice system's own structure does not reliably fill on its own. A society that only produces rigorous, credentialed second opinions in cases visible enough to attract a celebrity's attention is a society that has effectively outsourced a core function of equal justice to whoever happens to be famous, engaged, and watching at the right moment, which is another way of saying that access to forensic truth, in America right now, is not evenly distributed, no matter how evenly distributed the underlying tragedies actually are. That is worth sitting with regardless of what you think happened to Nolan Wells specifically, because it means the honesty of the answer this case eventually receives is, in part, a function of its virality, not purely a function of the facts. There is also no fixed public timeline for when that grand jury presentation happens, or when its outcome, if any indictment or noble decision is even made public, will be disclosed. District Attorney Angel Myers-McElrath has indicated findings will not be released until after that presentation. That could be weeks. Cases with far less public attention than this one have taken considerably longer. The Kendrick Johnson case, which we are about to walk through in detail, is the clearest possible illustration of just how long waiting for the process to conclude can actually stretch, and it is worth keeping that timeline in your head as a real, calibrated expectation rather than the compressed, algorithm-friendly timeline true crime content usually trains people to expect. It is also worth understanding why so little of the underlying investigative material has been made public so far, because that opacity itself becomes fuel for suspicion, when in a great many cases it is simply how the process is designed to function. Grand jury proceedings are, by law in nearly every state including Mississippi, conducted in secrecy, with strict rules limiting what prosecutors, witnesses, and jurors themselves are permitted to disclose publicly, both before and often after the proceeding concludes. That secrecy exists for reasons that have nothing to do with this specific case, protecting witnesses from intimidation, preventing pretrial publicity from contaminating a potential jury pool, and preserving the presumption of innocence for anyone who might ultimately be charged. It has the side effect, in a case this publicly visible, of looking exactly like concealment to an audience that has been trained by true crime media to expect investigators to narrate their findings in real time. They are not concealing evidence out of malice by declining to share it before a grand jury has even convened. They are, in the overwhelming majority of cases, simply following a legal framework built decades before anyone had to think about how an investigation's pacing would read against the expectations of a social media audience, checking for updates every few hours. Say that word again slowly because it is doing more work in this case than any other single word. Undetermined. Not cleared. Not confirmed. Suspended, deliberately, in the space between two conclusions that would each demand a very different response from the public, from investigators, and from the family. That suspended state is uncomfortable. It is supposed to be uncomfortable. And into that discomfort, in the weeks since, has poured almost every kind of speculation the internet is capable of producing. It is worth pausing on what that waiting period actually does to the people at the center of it, separate from the forensic question itself, because the psychological literature on ambiguous loss, grief without a clear, confirmed cause, is genuinely well established and directly applicable here, whatever eventually turns out to be true. Grief researchers have long distinguished between loss with a clear cause and closure and loss that remains ambiguous, where the fundamental facts of what happened are still contested or unknown. Families living through ambiguous loss consistently report worse psychological outcomes, more prolonged and complicated grief, than families who face even a devastating but clearly understood loss. The uncertainty itself is not a neutral, passive waiting room. It is an active, ongoing source of harm, independent of whichever direction the eventual answer breaks. That is true for the Wells family right now. It has been true for the Johnson family for 13 years. It is true, in a different but related form, for Shara Davis, who is not waiting on a forensic dispute so much as an investigative one, but who is nonetheless suspended in exactly the same kind of unresolved not knowing. None of the four families at the center of these four cases chose this. All of them are living inside a version of it regardless. Let's deal with the loudest piece of speculation directly, because it has been treated by some corners of the internet as though it were established fact, and it is not. An audio clip, amplified in part by Nancy Grace's coverage, has circulated claiming to capture voices near the scene saying something to the effect of, "Want me to cover him up? Or is he dead?" It is worth being fair and specific about where that clip actually gained its widest audience, because attribution matters here just as much as it does everywhere else in this piece. Nancy Grace has built a decades-long media career around exactly this kind of true crime commentary, dramatic, confident, unapologetically advocacy-driven programming that has, over the years, drawn both a large loyal audience and sustained criticism from media ethics observers for occasionally getting ahead of the actual evidentiary record in high-profile cases. That track record does not automatically make her coverage of this specific clip inaccurate. It does mean her platform operates under a different editorial standard than a wire service or a beat reporter working a legal desk, and a clip that gained mainstream traction specifically because it was amplified there deserves to be evaluated with that specific editorial context in mind, not treated as though it arrived through a neutral, purely evidentiary channel. This clip has been characterized by an attorney representing one of the friends present that day as potentially altered or fabricated. It has not been authenticated through any confirmed forensic audio analysis that has been made public. It has not been entered as verified evidence in any official proceeding that has been disclosed. Ask yourself, honestly, how many times you have heard that clip described in a headline or a thumbnail as though it were a confession, rather than as what it actually is, a disputed, unauthenticated recording whose origin and authenticity remain unresolved. Repeating that clip as though it were established evidence is not reporting. It is laundering an unverified claim through repetition until it starts to feel true simply because enough people have said it with enough confidence, a process that has nothing to do with whether the underlying claim is actually accurate and everything to do with how many times it has been reshared before it reached you. It is worth explaining, briefly, what actual audio authentication involves, because the word enhanced gets used constantly in coverage of this clip as though it were a neutral, purely technical process, when in practice it can mean almost anything from a rigorous forensic procedure to a simple volume boost run through consumer software. Genuine forensic audio authentication, the kind that could actually hold up under cross-examination in a courtroom, typically involves examining the file's original digital structure for signs of splicing or editing, analyzing background noise consistency across the recording for signs of manipulation, and, where possible, comparing the audio against the original recording device and its metadata to establish an unbroken chain of custody from the moment of capture to the moment it is presented as evidence. None of that has been publicly confirmed as having happened with this specific clip. What enhancement appears to mean, based on how the clip has actually been described in the coverage that popularized it, is a version run through noise reduction and volume amplification software of the kind widely available to any consumer, a process that can just as easily introduce artifacts, phantom sounds created by the software itself, misinterpreted by a listener's brain as words, as it can clarify something that was genuinely there. Human hearing is remarkably good at pattern matching vague sound into language it expects to hear, a phenomenon audio engineers sometimes call auditory pareidolia, the sonic cousin of seeing a face in a cloud. None of this proves the clip is fake. It proves that enhanced audio reveals is doing an enormous amount of persuasive work in this case's coverage, work that a genuine forensic authentication process, if one has been or ever is conducted, would either support or completely dismantle. Until that process happens publicly, the responsible label remains exactly where we put it a moment ago. There is a broader, newer risk worth flagging here too, one that did not exist in anything like its current form even 5 years ago. The tools available to convincingly manipulate audio and video, generating synthetic speech in a specific person's voice, altering the apparent content of an existing recording, have become dramatically more accessible and more convincing in a very short period of time. That does not mean this specific clip was generated or manipulated using those tools, and there is no evidence currently establishing that either way, in either direction, and it would be its own kind of irresponsible speculation to suggest otherwise without proof. It means the baseline level of caution any reasonable person should apply to a dramatic, uncorroborated audio or video clip circulating in a high-attention case has to be higher today than it would have been even a few years ago, simply because the technical barrier to fabricating something convincing has fallen so far. A healthy skepticism toward unverified media is no longer just good practice. In the current media environment, it is close to a survival skill, one this case, along with every high-profile case that comes after it, is going to keep testing. We are naming it here specifically so you know precisely what it is. Alleged, disputed, unauthenticated. Not confirmed. A related claim that circulated widely in early commentary about this case, including in some of the interview format discussion that first brought this case to a broad audience, deserves the same direct treatment. The suggestion that an official toxicology report was itself fabricated or falsified by state authorities to manufacture confusion. Toxicology results in a case like this one matter for a specific, narrow reason worth understanding clearly. A blood alcohol reading or the presence of another substance in a decedent's system speaks to impairment, meaning whether a person's judgment or physical coordination may have been affected in the moments before death, a question entirely separate from how that death actually occurred, and one that a careful pathologist would never conflate with the other. It does not, on its own, establish a mechanism of death, and a pathologist would never treat impairment as interchangeable with cause of death, because they measure two entirely different things. If reporting has indicated Wells had alcohol in his system, that finding, if accurate, would be relevant context about the day's events, but it would not answer the central forensic question this entire case turns on, whether the mark on the back of his skull reflects an injury or a naturally occurring post-mortem process. The specific claim that the toxicology report itself was deliberately falsified is a serious accusation of evidence tampering by state officials, and it is exactly the kind of claim that requires its own independent documentation before it can be treated as anything more than a suspicion. No such documentation has been made public. Until it is, that claim belongs precisely where the audio clip belongs, a serious allegation, not a demonstrated fact, and repeating it as though it were already proven does real damage to a case that does not need any more unverified claims layered onto an already difficult evidentiary picture. The same caution has to apply to the 4 friends who have been named across social media in connection with Wells' death, friends who were present on the island that day. Multiple attorneys representing those individuals, including counsel for one of the named friends, have publicly and explicitly called the viral accusations against their clients fabricated and have stated they are pursuing legal action against people spreading them. A separate, civilian-led reconstruction of the timeline, compiled by a volunteer search and rescue organization using publicly available footage and their own on-the-ground presence near the case, has also circulated widely, including a proposed account of a confrontation on the island around 5 p.m. It is important to be precise about what that reconstruction actually is and is not. It is the work of a private organization, made up of well-intentioned volunteers rather than sworn investigators with subpoena power, access to physical evidence, or the authority to compel testimony. Their analysis may raise genuinely useful questions, and organizations like it have, in other cases across the country, occasionally surfaced real leads that official investigations initially missed. But a civilian reconstruction of public footage is not an official investigative finding. It has not been vetted through the same evidentiary standards a prosecutor or court would require, and treating it with the same weight as a sworn statement or a forensic report collapses a meaningful distinction that this entire piece has been trying to preserve throughout. It belongs in the same category as the disputed audio clip, a lead worth investigators taking seriously, not a fact worth repeating as settled. Some of those friends have publicly stated they have raised significant sums toward legal defense specifically because of what their representatives describe as harassment and threats stemming from unproven online claims, money spent defending against accusations that, as of this recording, no prosecutor has ever formally made. As of the most recent reporting, no charges have been filed against any of the friends who were on that boat.
None. Zero.
If your understanding of this case includes a confident belief about which specific friend did it, that belief did not come from an investigation. It came from the internet doing what the internet does when a 2-hour gap in a timeline is left open long enough. It fills the silence with certainty that nobody has actually earned. There is a version of documentary storytelling that would name those 4 friends here, let the accusations breathe, and let you draw your own conclusion. That version is easier to make and it performs better because certainty is more watchable than doubt. It is also, functionally, defamation dressed up as curiosity, and it is exactly the kind of thing the friends' own lawyers say has already produced death threats against people who have never been charged with anything. So we're not doing it. What we know, for friends were present. What we do not know, what happened in the gap, and who, if anyone, bears responsibility for it. Hold both of those at once. That is the actual, honest, complete state of this case, whether or not it makes for a satisfying ending. There is a broader pattern worth naming here too, because it extends well past this specific case. The friends' legal representatives have publicly stated that a substantial 6-figure sum has been raised toward legal defense specifically because of what they describe as coordinated harassment and threats, explicitly characterizing the online campaign against their clients as, in their words, race-baiting exploitation of a tragedy for engagement. Whether or not you find that specific characterization persuasive, the underlying mechanism it describes is by now extremely well documented across many unrelated cases. A small number of named private citizens, none of them public figures by choice, becoming the target of sustained harassment and threats based on evidence that never actually rose to the level of a criminal charge. That mechanism does not require anyone involved to be malicious. It requires only an information vacuum, a compelling but incomplete narrative, and a large enough audience willing to fill in the missing pieces with confidence the facts do not support. It has happened in this case. It has happened in others before it. It will keep happening as long as content that names a confident villain outperforms content that says, honestly, we do not yet know. There is a real cost to the friends themselves worth reckoning with directly, separate from the question of what actually happened on that island. Being publicly, repeatedly named as a suspected killer, without ever being charged, without ever having the chance to formally answer the accusation in a courtroom where rules of evidence and cross-examination would actually apply, is its own distinct form of harm, one the legal system has almost no mechanism to fully undo, even if every accusation eventually turns out to be false. A criminal trial that ends in acquittal at least offers a defendant a formal, public, adjudicated vindication, a jury's actual verdict, entered into the record. A viral accusation that simply fades from relevance as the algorithm moves on to the next case offers nothing comparable, no formal closure, no public correction with anything like the reach of the original claim, just a name that will likely keep surfacing in search results and old comment threads for years, regardless of what a grand jury eventually decides or declines to decide. There is a legal concept worth borrowing here, even though it technically applies to jurors rather than online audiences, because the underlying principle transfers cleanly. Courts instruct jurors to decide a case based only on evidence formally admitted at trial, explicitly excluding anything they may have read or heard outside the courtroom, precisely because outside noise, rumor, incomplete leaks, confident-sounding commentary has been shown again and again to distort judgment in ways people do not fully notice happening to themselves. An online audience following a case like this one is never formally instructed that way, but the same distorting pressure is operating on them regardless, arguably with even less friction, since there is no judge, no oath, and no formal record to keep anyone honest about which claims they actually verified before forming an opinion. Approaching a case like this one with something like a juror's discipline, deliberately setting aside the clip, the thread, the confident host, and asking only what the documented record actually supports, is not a naturally occurring habit. It has to be chosen deliberately every single time a case like this pulls at you to skip that step, and it has to be chosen again the next time, and the time after that, because the pull never actually goes away. It just finds a new case to attach itself to. Now to the mother, because this is where the story stopped being purely about a death and started being about the cost of talking about one in public. Christine Wells Wansley, sometimes rendered Wansley, occasionally mistranscribed in interview audio as Wesley or Lay, is a family nurse practitioner. In the weeks after her son's death, an anonymous complaint was filed against her with the Mississippi Board of Nursing, alleging professional misconduct connected to her public advocacy for her own son's case. That complaint triggered a formal investigation, the kind of process that can affect a healthcare professional's license, employment, and reputation regardless of whether it ultimately produces discipline. It was closed, without any disciplinary action, in early August, roughly 5 weeks after her son's body was found. Ben Crump called the complaint frivolous and characterized it as an attempt to intimidate a grieving mother into silence. Whatever you believe about the underlying case, that sequence of events is worth sitting with on its own terms, separate from every other thread in the story. A woman lost her only son. Within weeks, while she was still in the earliest stage of processing that loss, before a funeral home bill was even likely paid off, she became the subject of a professional misconduct investigation tied directly to her decision to speak publicly about his death. It resolved in her favor, but resolution is not the same as harm undone. An investigation that goes nowhere still costs the person under investigation weeks of anxiety, legal exposure, and public scrutiny they did not choose and did not invite. That cost does not show up in any official record. It just gets absorbed quietly by a person who is already absorbing more than anyone should have to. There is a particular, almost uncomfortable irony worth naming in Christine Wells Wansley's professional background, because it cuts directly against a certain kind of commentary that has circulated about medical professionals and institutional trust more broadly in coverage of this case. She is not an outsider to the healthcare system skeptically observing it from a distance. She is inside it, a licensed clinician who has spent her career operating within the same broad medical infrastructure that includes the forensic pathologists, coroners, and medical examiners now disputing the cause of her son's death, colleagues, in the broadest professional sense, of the very people whose findings she now has every reason to question. That position does not give her any special forensic authority over her own son's autopsy findings. Being a nurse practitioner is a genuinely different specialty from forensic pathology, and nothing about her credentials qualifies her to adjudicate a hyoid bone dispute any more than any other grieving parent. But it does mean the version of this story that frames institutional medicine and a grieving Black family as simply opposed camps facing off across a divide misses something true and more complicated. The mother at the center of this case has built her entire professional life inside the same system she is now, in her most painful moment, being forced to publicly distrust. This is also the moment to name the parts of this story that are unambiguously, verifiably real, because it would be a mistake to let the disputed pieces overshadow the confirmed ones. The Congressional Black Caucus called for an independent federal investigation into Wells' death. Reverend Al Sharpton officiated the funeral and publicly pledged a $100,000 reward for information. Tyler Perry funded the funeral costs. A march in Gulfport drew a substantial crowd late in July that, by multiple accounts, included a wide cross-section of the community, not a single racial or political bloc, ordinary people from a Gulf Coast town standing in the heat because a teenager they may never have met did not come home from a boat trip. It is worth comparing how each of the four communities in this story actually mobilized, because the differences say something real about scale, timing, and resources, independent of the underlying merits of any individual case. The Wells case produced a march, a Congressional Black Caucus statement, a nationally broadcast funeral, and a $100,000 reward pledge, all within roughly 3 weeks of the body being recovered, an extraordinarily fast, extraordinarily large-scale mobilization by any historical standard. The Johnson case, by contrast, built its public support gradually over years, through sustained advocacy rather than a single explosive month, never quite achieving the same peak intensity, but sustaining attention over a far longer horizon, an entire adolescence's worth of anniversaries and renewed appeals. The Lacy case generated a serious, credentialed federal civil rights investigation within 4 months, but never produced the same scale of celebrity involvement or national march, its resolution driven more by the specific, falsifiable physical claim about the swing set than by sustained public pressure. And the Davis case, arguably the most under-resourced of the four, has relied almost entirely on a mother's individual persistence, a Change.org petition, and a modest fundraising campaign, without the celebrity attorneys, nationally broadcast funerals, or congressional statements that have defined the others. For families, for wildly different levels of institutional and public support, and, so far, 3 of the 4 still without anything resembling the clear answer they are each looking for. Whatever role public mobilization plays in eventually producing accountability, and it clearly plays some role, it is not, on its own, a reliable guarantee of it. It is worth naming, plainly and without editorializing, exactly who stepped forward and in what capacity, because the scale of that response is itself part of the confirmed record. Reverend Al Sharpton has spent decades as one of the most recognizable figures in American civil rights advocacy, and his decision to personally officiate the funeral placed this specific family's loss inside a tradition of public mourning he has led for other families in other high-profile cases over many years. Tyler Perry's funding of the funeral costs removed at least one immediate, practical burden from a family already facing the least practical, most overwhelming week of their lives. Colin Kaepernick's funding of the independent autopsy gave the family access to exactly the kind of credentialed second opinion this piece spent considerable time explaining most families simply cannot afford. None of these interventions determined what actually happened to Nolan Wells. All of them shaped how this specific family's version of an all-too-common tragedy was able to unfold in public, with resources, visibility, and support that most families enduring an unexplained death never receive. And on the other side of the same public storm, multiple people have been criminally charged for threats connected to this case. A man indicted for threats against the presiding judge, a woman charged over bomb threats, another individual charged over threats made against a witness. It is worth sitting inside that funeral for a moment rather than treating it as a single line in a list of confirmed facts, because it says something about the scale this case reached that a simple recitation of names does not fully capture. A funeral for an 18-year-old is, under any circumstances, one of the most unnatural events a family can be asked to endure, a ceremony built for a different point in the life cycle entirely, forced backward decades ahead of when it was ever supposed to happen. That this particular funeral was also a national news event, covered by outlets far beyond Mississippi, attended and funded by public figures with millions of followers of their own, does not make the grief inside it any less private or any less devastating for the people who actually knew him, his teachers, his teammates, his friends who were not on that boat. The family members who now have to explain to younger relatives why he is not coming to the next holiday. The scale of public attention and the scale of private loss are not the same thing, and a case like this one has a way of letting the first completely swallow the second in the public's mind, reducing a specific, unrepeatable human being to a symbol in an argument he never chose to be part of. The same thing happened to Kendrick Johnson, whose actual personality, the specific things his teachers and teammates remember about him, has been almost entirely displaced in public memory by the shorthand version of his case, a name attached to a gym mat and an unresolved dispute rather than to a 17-year-old with an actual life that extended well beyond the worst thing that ever happened to him. It happened to Lennon Lacy too, and it is, right now, happening to T.J. Davis, whose mother has spent 5 years fighting not just for an investigation, but for her son to be remembered as more than a headline about a storm drain. Every one of these 4 cases carries that same quiet second tragedy, layered on top of the first. A young person's entire identity gradually compressed in the public record, down to the manner and mystery of how they died. That compression is not something any single piece of coverage can fully avoid, this one included, simply by virtue of what a piece like this is structurally built to discuss. The least it can do is name that cost honestly, rather than pretending the analysis itself is free of it. This case generated real national attention, real institutional response, and real criminal conduct in its orbit, in both directions, all of it documented, none of it speculative. So where does that leave us, before we widen the lens any further? A confirmed timeline with a real gap in it. A confirmed forensic dispute between 2 credentialed medical authorities, resolved by neither into a clean answer. A confirmed set of unverified rumors, the audio clip, the specific accusations against named friends, that have circulated with far more confidence than the evidence supporting them deserves. And a confirmed pattern of institutional and public reaction, from Congress to state nursing board, that shows just how much this single, undetermined death has come to represent to a country that has been here before, more times than it wants to admit. Here's the thing this case does not do, and it is the reason we brought 3 other cases into this conversation. It does not exist in isolation. The forensic problem at its center, a body examined twice, by 2 credentialed authorities who reached different levels of certainty, with the family's independent examiner working under conditions the first examiner did not face, is not new. As happened before, in cases that ran all the way to their conclusions, for better or worse. Looking at how those cases actually resolved tells you something about what to realistically expect from this one, and it tells you something else too. It tells you how rare a clean, satisfying answer actually is, even when the entire country is watching, even when the pathologist has a national reputation, even when Congress gets involved. Before we go to those cases, it is worth pausing on why this pattern exists at all, because it is not random, and pretending it is random is its own kind of dishonesty. There is a documented historical backdrop here that is not speculation, it is public record. Mississippi, along with several other southern states, has a well-documented history of lynchings that were staged, recorded, or ruled as accidents, suicides, or unexplained deaths in official records for decades, a pattern extensively documented by historians and by organizations like the Equal Justice Initiative, which has cataloged more than 4,000 documented racial terror lynchings across a dozen southern states between 1877 and 1950 alone, with Mississippi recording more of them than any other state in that count. That is not a statistic offered for shock value. It is offered because it establishes, with real documentary weight, that the specific fear driving skepticism toward this specific undetermined ruling, the fear that an official record can be quietly, permanently wrong about how a Black person in Mississippi actually died, is not a fear invented for this case. It is a fear with a 4,000-entry paper trail behind it, accumulated over generations, in the exact state where this case is unfolding. That history does not prove anything specific about what happened to Nolan Wells. It would be intellectually dishonest to claim that it does. But it explains, in a way that pure speculation about this individual case never could on its own, why a community's default posture toward an undetermined ruling in a case like this one is skepticism rather than trust, and why that skepticism arrives fully formed, long before any specific evidence in this case has even had the chance to justify it. That skepticism was not invented in July of 2026. It was inherited generation after generation from a documented record of exactly the kind of institutional silence this case is now producing. Understanding that does not settle the forensic questions. It does explain the emotional temperature around them, and any honest account of this case has to hold both of those things without collapsing one into the other. A community does not need to believe, with certainty, that this specific death was a homicide to be reasonably unwilling to simply accept an undetermined ruling at face value. It only needs to know its own history well enough to recognize that undetermined has, in the past, sometimes served as a permanent, unchallenged substitute for an answer nobody in power was ever actually required to give. It is also worth widening the lens on the coroner system itself for a moment, because Mississippi is far from the only place in the country where this particular structural weakness exists, and treating it as a uniquely Mississippi problem lets the rest of the country off the hook too easily. A substantial number of states across the country still use an elected coroner system rather than an appointed medical examiner system for at least some jurisdictions, and in many of those states, the position carries no formal requirement that the officeholder be a physician at all, only that they win a local election. Some of the country's most respected death investigation systems have moved entirely away from that model towards centralized, appointed medical examiner offices staffed exclusively by board-certified forensic pathologists, precisely because of the kind of inconsistency this structure can produce. Mississippi has not made that full transition. Neither have a number of other states in every region of the country, not only the South. That national pattern does not make the specific frustrations in this specific case any less real. It does mean that framing this as a uniquely Mississippi failure, rather than a widespread, documented structural weakness in how the United States investigates sudden and unexplained deaths generally, understates how common the underlying problem actually is and how many other families, in states nobody is currently marching in, are quietly living through some version of the exact same uncertainty. The single most cited example of that inherited history is not from Mississippi at all, though it happened close enough, geographically and culturally, that it belongs in this conversation. In August of 1955, 14-year-old Emmett Till, visiting relatives in Money, Mississippi, was abducted, beaten, and killed, his body later recovered from the Tallahatchie River. His mother, Mamie Till Mobley, made the decision to hold an open casket funeral specifically so the public could see exactly what had been done to her son, a decision widely credited with galvanizing the civil rights movement in the years that followed. 2 men were tried for his murder and acquitted by an all-white jury in a matter of minutes. Decades later, both men, protected by double jeopardy, admitted in a published interview that they had in fact killed him. That case is not being invoked here to draw a direct forensic parallel to Nolan Wells. The 2 cases are different in almost every specific respect, but to establish something simpler and more foundational, the distrust of family in Mississippi carries into an undetermined ruling today did not appear from nowhere. It has a documented, 70-year through line, and Emmett Till's case is the clearest single data point proving that an official, institutional conclusion in this exact region has, at least once, been definitively wrong, acknowledged as wrong by the people responsible, decades after the fact and far too late for it to matter to the person who died. There is a more specific, more technical piece of that historical backdrop worth understanding as well, because it speaks directly to the mechanics of this exact case, rather than only to the emotional context around it. Mississippi, like a number of states, elects coroners at the county level, and Mississippi law has historically not required an elected coroner to hold a medical degree or specific forensic credentials, a structural fact about the office itself, not an accusation against any individual currently holding it. This is a distinct role from a medical examiner, who is a credentialed forensic pathologist typically involved when a death requires a more rigorous, medically expert determination. Understanding that distinction matters here specifically because it explains why an independent, board-certified forensic pathologist like Dr. Mitchell can look at a case that has already received an official ruling and reasonably conclude that the original examination, however well-intentioned, may not have applied the same level of forensic rigor a case this consequential arguably deserved from the outset. That is a structural critique of a system, not a personal accusation against any specific official, and the distinction matters enormously because collapsing this system has structural weaknesses into this specific person acted corruptly is precisely the kind of leap that turns a legitimate institutional critique into an unproven personal accusation. The same trap the audio clip and the friend accusations fall into elsewhere in this case. The clearest structural parallel to the Wells case, the one that maps almost point for point onto its central dispute, is the death of Kendrick Johnson, and it is worth walking through in real detail because the shorthand version most people have heard leaves out exactly the parts that make it useful here. In January of 2013, a 17-year-old black high school student in Valdosta, Georgia, was found dead, folded inside an upright, rolled gymnastics mat in his school gym. He had gone into the mat, according to the official version of events, reaching for a shoe that had rolled inside and became trapped, upside down, unable to free himself, ultimately suffocating from positional asphyxia. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation conducted the first autopsy and ruled the death accidental, aligning with that explanation. To a great many people, especially people who had ever actually examined how those mats are constructed, tightly rolled, narrow at the opening, standing upright and secured, that explanation strained credulity. It required believing a healthy, athletic teenager became so thoroughly wedged inside a rolled mat that he could not extract himself in a school gymnasium during business hours, without anyone hearing him or noticing until it was too late. The family did not accept it, and their skepticism only deepened as details of the initial investigation emerged, including allegations that evidence from the scene, blood found on nearby items, had been mishandled or gone missing before it could be properly analyzed, allegations that fueled years of additional distrust in the official process. The details that emerged in the months following Johnson's death only deepened the family's distrust of the official account. Investigators reportedly found blood on a wrestling mat and other items in the gym, evidence that, according to the family's later legal filings, was not properly preserved or fully tested before it went missing from evidence storage entirely. A breakdown in basic chain of custody that would be alarming in any case and became a focal point of the family's civil litigation against the school system and various individuals connected to the investigation. Surveillance footage from the gym that morning was reportedly missing critical minutes, gaps the school system attributed to a malfunctioning camera system, an explanation the family and their supporters found difficult to accept given how central those minutes were to understanding what actually happened. None of these procedural failures, on their own, prove that Johnson's death was anything other than a tragic accident. But they illustrate something important about why forensic disputes like this one metastasize into years-long public battles. It is rarely just the autopsy that erodes public trust. It is the accumulation of smaller procedural failures around it, each individually explainable, that collectively make an accidental death, ruling much harder for a grieving family to simply accept at face value. Valdosta, Georgia in January of 2013 was not, on paper, a town primed for the kind of years-long national controversy that followed. Johnson was a well-liked student, an athlete, someone with no known history of the kind of conflict that might otherwise explain an act of violence against him. That absence of an obvious motive or obvious suspect is itself part of why the case became so difficult to resolve. Where the Wells case has at least a named group of friends present during a confirmed window of time, giving investigators a defined universe of people to examine, the Johnson case never had that same starting point. Nobody was ever clearly placed with him during whatever window mattered most, no equivalent of the 223 to 431 gap with a defined group of names attached to it. That absence of even a contested cast of characters is part of why, 13 years later, the case remains not just unresolved but in many ways unstarted in terms of ever identifying who, if anyone, might bear responsibility, a genuinely different and in some ways bleaker category of unresolved than the Wells case currently occupies. The family, like the Wells family more than a decade later, commissioned an independent second autopsy. After Johnson's body was exhumed, forensic pathologist Dr. William Anderson examined it and reached a dramatically different conclusion than the state's official ruling. He found evidence of unexplained blunt force trauma to the neck and jaw, findings inconsistent with the reached in for a shoe and got stuck theory the state had settled on. 2 credentialed forensic pathologists. 2 examinations of the same body. 2 incompatible stories about how a teenager died. Sound familiar? Here is where the Kendrick Johnson case adds a layer that the Wells case, so far, has not reached, and it is a layer worth understanding closely because it complicates any assumption that more examinations automatically produce more clarity. The GBI commissioned yet another examination, a third autopsy, and that third autopsy sided with the original accidental death finding, not with the family's independent pathologist. So now you have three credentialed opinions, two of them aligned with each other, one standing alone, and even that numeric majority did not settle the public dispute because the family and a substantial portion of the public watching the case unfold in real time on social media for the first time in a case like this continued to view the state-aligned findings as compromised by the same institutions that had already handled the initial investigation clumsily. Three opinions. No consensus that anyone actually trusted. That is the uncomfortable lesson sitting inside this case. Adding more forensic voices to a dispute does not automatically resolve it. Sometimes it just multiplies the number of conclusions a grieving family has to choose between believing. It is worth understanding why the family and much of the watching public found the third autopsy's conclusions so difficult to simply accept, rather than treating that resistance as unreasonable on its face. The third examination was commissioned by the same state agency, the GBI, that had produced the original ruling the family was already disputing, a structural conflict of interest that does not automatically make the third autopsy's findings inaccurate, but does make it a genuinely awkward source of reassurance for a family already convinced the state's process could not be trusted to police itself. And it is difficult to fault them for that conviction given everything that had already gone missing by the time they were asked to trust it again. An independent, truly neutral third opinion, commissioned by neither the state nor the family, might have carried more persuasive weight in either direction. That kind of neutral, third-party arbiter essentially never exists in cases like this one, because there is no standing institution whose sole job is to referee disputes between a state medical examiner and a family's independent pathologist. Each side simply keeps commissioning opinions that align with whichever side is paying for them, an adversarial structure that produces exactly the kind of unresolved stalemate the Johnson case has been stuck in for over a decade, and a structure the Wells case, so far, has not even reached the third round of yet. The Department of Justice opened a federal civil rights investigation into Johnson's death. It ran for years, well past the point where most news coverage had moved on to other stories, well past the point where most of the public had stopped actively following it. On June 20th, 2016, more than 3 years after Johnson died, the DOJ closed that investigation and filed no charges, stating there was insufficient evidence to pursue federal civil rights charges. That should have been the end of it, procedurally. It was not the end of it, practically. The Lowndes County Sheriff's Office has stated as recently as 2026, 13 years after Johnson's death, that the case remains technically open. No one has ever been criminally charged in connection with Kendrick Johnson's death. 13 years later, his family still does not have the version of certainty that a closed, prosecuted case would provide. What they have instead is a permanent, unresolved, undetermined, almost identical in shape to where the Wells case currently stands, just aged over a much longer arc of time than anyone reading this today has had to sit with the Wells case so far. The Johnson family did not stop at the federal investigation. They pursued civil litigation against multiple parties connected to the case for years, litigation that itself became a secondary battlefield, with courts weighing procedural questions about evidence handling and institutional responsibility that never quite crossed into the criminal realm the family was actually seeking. Kendrick Johnson's parents have said in interviews over the years that what they wanted was never a guarantee of a particular outcome, only a genuinely thorough process, one where the physical evidence was preserved well enough and examined seriously enough that whatever conclusion it reached could actually be trusted. That is a strikingly modest request, considering what it took to not receive it. 13 years, 3 autopsies, a federal investigation, and a civil court docket later, that basic trust in the process is still the thing the family says they never got. It is also worth understanding how the Johnson case actually kept itself alive in the public consciousness for as long as it did, because the mechanism is instructive. Unlike the Wells case, which arrived into a media environment already saturated with short-form video and algorithmic amplification, the Johnson case built its public presence more gradually, Through sustained local reporting, a small number of dedicated national outlets that kept returning to it year after year, and the family's own persistent public advocacy, including annual anniversary statements and continued media appearances well past the point where most true crime attention naturally
moves on.
That slower-burning model of public pressure produced a case that stayed technically open for over a decade, but it never produced the same explosive, all-at-once national mobilization the Wells case generated within its first month. Different eras of media, different mobilization patterns, the same underlying result, an undetermined ruling that outlasted the news cycle that made it famous, whether that news cycle burned fast or slow, leaving a family to keep fighting long after the cameras that once surrounded them had already moved on to somewhere else. There is a broader pattern of declining institutional trust worth situating this case inside as well, because the Wells case is not occurring in a vacuum. It is occurring at a moment when public confidence in a wide range of American institutions, courts, law enforcement, medical authorities, and news media alike has been measured, across years of independent survey research, as lower than it has been in generations. That erosion did not begin with this case, and it will not end with it either. It provides an important part of the backdrop explaining why an undetermined ruling in 2026 detonates into national headlines within days, in a way a similarly ambiguous ruling might not have a generation ago. A public already primed to expect institutional failure treats every new ambiguous case as further confirmation of a pattern it already believes in, sometimes accurately, sometimes not, and untangling which specific instance belongs to which category is precisely the work this piece has been trying to do, one confirmed fact and one disputed rumor at a time. That is the warning embedded in this comparison, and it deserves to be said plainly rather than implied. Dueling autopsies, even when one of them is conducted by a credentialed, high-profile pathologist working on behalf of a grieving family, do not reliably produce resolution. They produce competing narratives that can coexist, unresolved, for over a decade, generating enormous public attention and very little actual forward motion in the case itself. If your expectation, watching the Nolan Wells case unfold, is that Dr. Mitchell's findings are going to force a prosecution or a definitive answer in the near term, the Kendrick Johnson case is the most direct, most sobering evidence available that this is not how these disputes usually resolve. Public pressure changes the volume of a case. It does not reliably change the outcome. 13 years of a family's life is the price of learning that lesson the hard way, and it is a price the Wells family may already be quietly, privately bracing for, whether or not anyone around them is saying it out loud yet. Now, the second comparative case, and this one earns its place here precisely because it broke the other way, because it is proof that these disputes can be adjudicated to something resembling a documented, examined conclusion, even when that conclusion is painful, and even when a lot of people going and expected it to go differently. Bladenboro, North Carolina is a small town, population in the low thousands, the kind of place where a single relationship can become common knowledge across the entire community within days. Its history includes documented incidents of racial violence stretching back generations, a history that, as with Mississippi, shaped how the community reacted the moment word spread that a black teenager involved with a white woman had been found hanging from a swing set. That reaction split almost immediately along lines that will sound familiar by now. Some residents accepted the official suicide ruling without difficulty, pointing to Lacy's own documented struggles in the period before his death, while others, including his own family, felt the relationship itself and the social tension it had reportedly generated in the weeks before he died made a swift, unchallenged suicide ruling feel premature at best and willfully incurious at worst, too sincerely held. Interpretations of the same small town split almost entirely along the same lines that had shaped that town for generations before Lacy was ever born. Lennon Lacy was 17 years old, living in Bladenboro, North Carolina, a small town with its own long and specific history around race and romance across racial lines. He was dating a white woman older than him at the time of his death, a relationship that, in a town like Bladenboro, was not without social friction his family has said they were aware of and concerned about even before anything happened to him. On August 29, 2014, he was found hanging from a swing set near his home. North Carolina's chief state medical examiner ruled the death a suicide. The family did not accept that ruling, and their skepticism was not baseless. A pathologist retained independently by the family, supported by the NAACP, raised a specific, concrete problem with the state's conclusion. There was no object at the scene adequate for Lacy to have stood on and then kicked away, which is a basic mechanical requirement for the type of hanging the state described. Without something to climb onto and then remove, the physical mechanics of the state's own theory did not fully add up. The family's pathologist also noted that the state medical examiner had reportedly not been provided scene photographs or precise measurements of the swing set structure before finalizing the suicide ruling, a procedural gap that, if accurate, meant the original conclusion had been reached without some of the basic physical documentation you would expect to inform it. That is a legitimate, specific, falsifiable criticism of a forensic conclusion, not vague distrust, an actual identified gap in the state's process, one that could in principle be checked against the physical record. That falsifiability is the entire difference between a legitimate forensic dispute and a rumor dressed up as one, and it is precisely what separates it from the audio clip and the toxicology fabrication claims circulating around the Wells case. A claim that can, in principle, be checked against a fixed physical object, a swing set that still exists, a bone that either was or was not sent for examination, is a fundamentally different category of claim than an assertion about someone's hidden intent or a recording whose provenance nobody can trace. The Lacy family's pathologist did not simply say the state's conclusion felt wrong. He identified a specific, testable mechanical problem with it, and that specificity is exactly what gave the FBI something concrete to actually investigate, rather than a feeling to weigh against another feeling. There were other details that fed the family's suspicion in the days immediately after Lacy's death, details that, taken individually, might mean little, but that accumulated the same way the smaller procedural failures in the Johnson case did. The family has said Lacy was found wearing shoes that were reportedly too small for him and did not appear to be his own, an inconsistency they felt was never adequately explained by investigators. They also raised questions about the speed with which local law enforcement settled on a suicide determination before, in the family's account, a full forensic workup of the scene had been completed. Local investigators maintained throughout that they followed standard procedure and found nothing to indicate the death was anything other than what it appeared to be. Two honest accounts of the same set of facts, arriving at very different conclusions about how carefully those facts had actually been gathered. That criticism was serious enough that it triggered a federal civil rights investigation, publicly announced by the FBI in December of 2014, roughly 4 months after Lacy's death, a far faster institutional response than either the Johnson or, so far, the Wells case has seen. This is the part of the story that matters most for what it tells you about how these disputes can actually end. The FBI and Department of Justice did not simply defer to the original state ruling out of institutional courtesy. They investigated the specific challenge the family's pathologist had raised, examining the physical scene, the mechanics of the hanging, the procedural gaps the independent pathologist had flagged. And in June of 2016, they concluded there was no evidence to support federal criminal civil rights charges. The suicide ruling stood. Not because it went unchallenged, but because it survived the challenge on the merits, with an actual documented investigative record behind that survival rather than institutional silence. Put the two cases side by side, and the contrast is the entire point of bringing them into this conversation together. In the Lacy case, a specific, well-defined forensic dispute was raised, taken seriously by a federal investigative body, and actually adjudicated to a documented conclusion, even though that conclusion was the harder one for the family to accept, even though it did not vindicate their independent pathologist's implicit theory. In the Johnson case, a nearly identical structure, family skepticism, independent pathologist, federal investigation, ran for years and closed without ever producing a conclusion anyone considered final, leaving an undetermined that has now outlived the length of an entire adolescence. Same shape of dispute, two completely different endings. That should tell you something important, something worth carrying into every future case you watch unfold in real time on your phone. The presence of a credentialed second opinion is not, by itself, predictive of how a case resolves. What matters, more than the credentials of any single examiner, is whether the underlying physical evidence is specific and preserved enough to actually be adjudicated by whatever body eventually looks at it closely. And that is exactly the open question hanging over the Wells case right now because of what was and was not sent to Dr. Mitchell, and because of how much time had already passed before he ever opened the body bag. The Lacy case had a swing set that still existed, that could still be measured, photographed, examined for mechanical plausibility years after the fact if necessary. The Wells case has a hyoid bone that, as far as the public record shows, may never be examined by the family's own expert at all. It is worth noting, too, that the Lacy family's acceptance of the federal conclusion was never total, and that matters for how we should think about what resolution actually means in cases like this. Lacy's mother has continued, in interviews given years after the DOJ closed its investigation, to say she does not believe her son died by suicide, regardless of what the federal findings concluded. A documented, adjudicated conclusion is not the same thing as a wound that is closed. The Lacy case did not give that family peace. It gave them an answer, examined and defended by a federal agency, that they have chosen, understandably, not to accept as the final word on their own son's life. That distinction between an answer and acceptance of that answer is worth carrying into every subsequent case in this conversation, because it is entirely possible for the Wells case to eventually produce a documented conclusion, in either direction, without that conclusion ever actually resolving anything for the people who loved him most. It is worth noting, too, that a federal declination to pursue civil rights charges is a specific, narrow legal outcome, not a broad, general certification that everything about a state's original handling of a case was beyond criticism. The federal standard for civil rights prosecution requires proving specific intent tied to a protected characteristic, a notably high bar, higher in some respects than the standard a state-level criminal prosecution or a civil lawsuit would require, precisely because Congress built federal civil rights statutes to reach a narrower category of conduct than ordinary state homicide law already covers, not to duplicate it. It is entirely possible, in principle, for the DOJ to correctly conclude it cannot meet that specific federal standard while separate, valid criticisms of a state investigation's thoroughness remain completely unaddressed. That nuance rarely survives translation into a headline, where FBI closes investigation tends to get read by the public as a full, comprehensive exoneration of everyone and everything involved in the original process, rather than the narrower, more technical legal conclusion it actually represents. Which brings us to the third comparative case, and this one is here for a different reason than the other two. It is here because parts of the story you have probably already heard about it are not accurate, and getting them right matters just as much as getting the Wells case right, maybe more because inaccuracy here does a specific kind of damage. It flattens a real family's real, unresolved grievance into a version of events that is easier to be outraged about, but is not actually what happened. Ticken Davis Jr., known as TJ, was 20 years old, from Little Canada, Minnesota. On August 29, 2021, he drowned in the Mississippi River in St. Paul. Here is the correction that needs to be made plainly because it has circulated inaccurately in commentary about this case, including in versions you may have already encountered, possibly including the very interview clip that brought you here. This was not a boat outing. Davis and a group of others were exploring storm drain tunnels near the riverbank when a thunderstorm caused sudden flash flooding. The rising water swept the group into the river itself, a genuinely chaotic, fast-moving event, not a leisurely afternoon that turned sinister. 2 of them managed to get out under their own power. 3, including Davis, were carried further by the current. His body was recovered the next morning near the Marshall Street Bridge, after an overnight search that his family has described as agonizing. 2 more corrections need to be made here, both important, both in service of not repeating claims that cannot currently be sourced to anything solid, because that is precisely the standard we have been holding the Wells case to, and it would be hypocritical not to hold this case to the same one. There is no verified reporting confirming that Davis was the strongest swimmer among the group that night. That detail, wherever it originated, does not appear in the documented coverage of the case. And there is no confirmed reporting establishing the racial composition of the friends he was with as a defined fact presented by investigators or credible reporting. Those specifics may circulate in commentary and conversation about the case, but repeating them as established fact, when they cannot be traced to verified sourcing, is exactly the kind of quiet fabrication by repetition this entire piece has been trying to avoid from its very first sentence. So we are not repeating them as fact here, and if you have heard them stated confidently elsewhere, that confidence was not earned. The night itself, based on the confirmed reporting, unfolded quickly and chaotically in a way that stands in real contrast to the day-long, documented boat trip at the center of the Wells case. A storm drain system near a river is, under normal conditions, a place people explore without incident, water levels low, the tunnels dry or only shallowly wet. A sudden, heavy thunderstorm changes that calculus in minutes, not hours, turning a dry or shallow passage into a flash flood channel with startling speed, a well-documented hazard that claims lives in storm drain and slot canyon environments around the country almost every year, independent of who happens to be inside them. That does not mean nothing questionable happened that night. It means the physical mechanism of death here, a flash flood sweeping a group of people into a river, is a starkly different starting point than a body found on a beach after an unexplained multi-hour gap, and treating the two cases as forensic twins, the way some commentary comparing them has, misrepresents both. What is confirmed, and what matters most, is this. Davis's mother, Shara Davis, has said publicly and repeatedly that St. Paul police never formally interviewed the men who were with her son that night at any police station, and she has continued demanding that the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, or the FBI, reopen the case. There is an active petition, Justice for Ticken Davis Jr., and a fundraising effort to support a private attorney and a second, independent look at the case. As of the most recent available reporting, there have been no arrests and no confirmed reopening of the case by state or federal authorities. It remains, formally, an accidental drowning during a flash flood. It remains, for his mother, an open wound with unanswered procedural questions about how thoroughly the people who were present that night were actually questioned by the people whose job it was to ask. Before moving past these three dueling autopsy cases, it is worth naming a pattern that runs underneath all of them, one none of the individual case summaries fully captures on its own. In the Wells case, the hyoid bone and surrounding throat structures, the single set of evidence most capable of definitively addressing neck trauma, were not available to the family's independent examiner. In the Johnson case, blood evidence collected near the scene reportedly went missing from evidence storage before it could be fully tested, and minutes of surveillance footage covering the critical window were reportedly lost to a camera malfunction. In the Lacy case, the state medical examiner reportedly reached a suicide ruling without ever receiving scene photographs or precise measurements of the swing set structure central to that ruling. 3 different states, 3 different decades, roughly, 3 different specific pieces of evidence. The same underlying shape, again and again. The exact piece of information that would have most directly settled the central question was, for reasons that ranged from procedurally defensible to genuinely unexplained, simply not there by the time anyone independent got a chance to look. It happened with a bone. It happened with blood evidence and missing camera footage. It happened with a set of measurements never taken and photographs never shared. 3 different physical forms of the exact same failure, occurring in 3 different states, decades apart, against 3 different families who had never met each other and had no reason to coordinate their grievances, arriving independently at the identical conclusion. Whatever conclusively would have settled the question was, each time, the one thing the second examiner never got to see. That repetition, across cases with no connection to each other beyond the pattern itself, is either an extraordinary coincidence occurring 3 separate times, or it is evidence of a structural weakness in how sudden, racially fraught deaths get initially investigated in this country, a weakness that shows up consistently enough to be worth taking seriously as a pattern rather than dismissing case by case as an isolated, unfortunate accident each time. Neither of those 2 explanations, notably, requires believing that any individual official in any of these 3 cases acted with corrupt intent. A pattern can be structural, without a single person in it being a villain, and recognizing that distinction is exactly the kind of nuance this entire piece has been trying to model rather than flatten. Notice what this 3rd case is not, because the distinction matters, and precision about that distinction is the entire discipline this piece keeps returning to. It is not a dueling autopsy case like Wells, Johnson, or Lacy. There has been no independent second autopsy commissioned and publicized in Davis's case the way there was in the other three. The dispute here is not about competing forensic conclusions. It is about the thoroughness of the investigation itself, about whether the people present that night were ever meaningfully questioned at all, a completely different category of grievance than a fight between two pathologists over a bone that was or was not shipped to the right city. That is a different kind of injustice than the ones driving the Wells case, and it is worth understanding the difference clearly, because collapsing every young black person's death near water into the same template, as if they're all the same story with the names changed, actually erases the specific, documented facts that make each of these cases what they individually actually are. Davis's case is a story about investigative thoroughness. Johnson's is a story about forensic disagreement that outlived resolution. Lacy's is a story about a forensic disagreement that got a real, documented answer. Wells's, right now, today, is still being written, and it currently looks most like Johnson's, an unresolved Undetermined, with the clock already running. Shira Davis has said in interviews that what frustrates her most is not necessarily a belief that she knows exactly what happened to her son that night. It is the much simpler, much more damning fact that, by her account, nobody in a position of authority ever sat the surviving members of that group down and asked them, formally on the record, to walk through the sequence of events. Whatever the answer to that question would have turned out to be, the absence of the question itself is what has kept this case open in her mind for half a decade, an absence that costs the state nothing to explain, and yet has never once been explained to her. Unlike the Wells case, Davis's story has never generated the kind of national institutional response that produced a Congressional Black Caucus statement, a celebrity-funded second autopsy, or a nationally broadcast funeral. It has remained, for 5 years, a largely local grievance, carried almost entirely by one mother's persistence, a modest petition, and a community fundraiser rather than a national media apparatus. That disparity is itself worth sitting with, because it raises an honest, uncomfortable question about which cases receive the scale of scrutiny capable of actually producing answers, and which cases, equally deserving of that scrutiny by any reasonable ethical standard, simply never catch the same current. Nothing about the underlying facts of the Davis case makes it inherently less worthy of national attention than the Wells case. What differs is scale, timing, the presence or absence of a high-profile attorney willing to take it on, and frankly, luck, in exactly the sense that phrase should make anyone paying attention uncomfortable. That is a distinctly different kind of grievance than the ones anchoring the other three cases in this conversation, and it deserves to be understood on those terms rather than folded into a broader, less accurate narrative simply because the surface details, a young black man, water, an unresolved family, rhyme with the others. Before we widen the lens any further, it is worth turning this exact standard, confirmed versus alleged, back onto the wave of commentary that made this case as visible as it is in the first place, because a genuinely critical look at this story cannot only fact-check the official record. It has to fact-check the loudest unofficial voices too. The interviews, the reaction shows, the confident hosts explaining medicine, genetics, and criminal history to millions of people in a single sitting. A few specific claims that circulated widely in that kind of commentary deserve the same scrutiny we have applied to the audio clip and the friend accusations, because repetition does not make any of them more accurate, regardless of how sincerely they were delivered. One recurring claim involves the concept of intergenerational or epigenetic trauma, the idea that the psychological weight of historical trauma, slavery, lynching, systemic discrimination is passed down biologically, encoded into DNA across generations. There is real, peer-reviewed science behind epigenetics as a field, the study of how environmental factors can influence gene expression without altering the underlying DNA sequence itself, and there is a growing legitimate body of research into how chronic stress and trauma can produce measurable biological effects, including in the children of people who lived through severe trauma. That research is real and worth taking seriously. But the version of the claim that often gets repeated in commentary, that a specific number of generations' worth of trauma is quantifiably carried in the blood in a precise, countable way, oversimplifies an area of science that remains genuinely contested and actively studied, not settled. citing real science loosely, stretching a legitimate field of study into a more dramatic and more certain claim than the research actually supports, is its own quieter version of the same problem this entire piece has been naming throughout, turning something real into something more sensational than the evidence underneath it can currently bear. A second claim, made more obliquely but unmistakably in some of the commentary around this case, draws a direct causal line between the Tuskegee syphilis study and the origin of HIV, suggesting the 4-year gap between the studies end in 1972 and the first documented HIV cases in the early 1980s is itself suspicious. This deserves a direct, unambiguous correction because the two things are being conflated in a way the historical record does not support. The Tuskegee study was a real, documented, deeply unethical experiment in which the U.S. Public Health Service withheld treatment from Black men with syphilis for decades, without their informed consent, to observe the disease's untreated progression, a case study in institutional racism and medical betrayal that rightly still shapes trust in healthcare systems today. But there is no credible scientific evidence linking that study to the origin of HIV, which the overwhelming scientific consensus traces to a zoonotic transmission event from primates in Central Africa occurring decades earlier than either event. Conflating these two distinct histories does not strengthen a legitimate case for distrust in American medical institutions. It weakens it by attaching a real, documented atrocity to an unrelated and unsupported claim, giving critics an easy, accurate rebuttal that then gets used to wave away everything else being said, including the parts that are entirely true. A third claim worth examining involves specific allegations about the county medical examiner's professional track record, the suggestion that she has a documented pattern, specifically in cases involving Black victims, of ruling death suicide or undetermined when families and communities believed otherwise. This is precisely the kind of claim that, if true, would be enormously significant and worth serious investigative scrutiny by actual journalists with the resources to review case files systematically. It is also precisely the kind of claim that cannot be responsibly repeated here, in this piece, without that underlying documentation in hand. Our research for this case was not able to independently verify a specific, sourced pattern of prior rulings matching that description. That does not mean the claim is false. It means it is currently unverified, which, by the exact standard this entire piece has applied to everything else, from the audio clip to the friend accusations to the specific details of T.J. Davis's case, means it does not belong in the confirmed column. If that pattern exists and can be documented through actual case records, it deserves real investigative reporting, not a confident aside delivered on a live stream, reporting that names its sources, cites the specific rulings in question, and can stand behind every claim in a way a single dramatic sentence never has to. Until then, it stays exactly where the audio clip stays. Alleged, not confirmed. There is a fourth pattern worth naming, less a factual claim than a rhetorical technique, and it deserves scrutiny precisely because it is persuasive without actually being evidence. Commentary built around this case frequently frames its host or commentator as a numbers guy, someone driven purely by statistics and probability rather than emotion or ideology, immediately before pivoting into some of the most speculative, emotionally charged claims in the entire conversation, comments about who specifically might be responsible, comments about a public official's suspected corruption, comments built on inference rather than any actual number. That framing device, positioning oneself as uniquely rational immediately before making an unsupported leap, is a well-documented persuasion technique, borrowing the credibility of statistical reasoning without doing any actual statistical reasoning. It works because audiences generally do lower their skepticism toward a speaker who has just told them how skeptical and evidence-driven they are. Naming the technique does not mean every claim made using it is automatically false. It means the technique itself should not be mistaken for the presence of evidence, and a critical viewer owes it to themselves to separate the framing from the substance underneath it, in this case and in every other piece of persuasive commentary they encounter afterward. None of this is offered to discredit the underlying distrust driving this case, which, as the history of Emmett Till and the broader documented record of racial terror lynchings across the South makes clear, is not irrational or invented. It is offered because a genuinely critical account of this story has to apply its own standard evenly to the institutions being questioned and to the commentary questioning them, or it is not actually being critical. It is just picking a side and calling the process journalism. It is worth stepping back here for a moment and talking honestly about why cases like this get flattened in the first place, because that flattening is not an accident, and understanding the mechanism behind it is part of watching this responsibly. When a case generates this much attention this quickly, an entire ecosystem of commentary, reaction, and monetized speculation forms around it almost overnight. Some of that ecosystem is careful. A lot of it is not, because careful content is slower to make and often performs worse than confident content. A video that says, "Here is what remains unproven," will, on almost every platform, get outperformed by a video that says, "Here is who did it," even when the second video has done a fraction of the actual work. That incentive structure is not unique to this case. It has shaped coverage of Kendrick Johnson, of Lennon Lacy, of TJ Davis, and it will shape coverage of whatever case comes after Nolan Wells, because the underlying economics of attention have not changed, only the names have. It is worth naming the specific mechanics of that incentive structure, because understanding them is the only real defense against being pulled along by them without noticing. A platform's recommendation system does not reward accuracy. It rewards retention, the amount of time a viewer spends watching before clicking away, and completion, whether they make it to the end. A video that opens with a confident, specific claim, a named suspect, a decoded audio clip, a corrupt official caught in the act, produces a stronger opening hook than a video that opens by explaining the limits of what anyone currently knows. That is not a moral failing unique to any one creator. It is a structural pull built into the architecture every single piece of content on every platform is competing inside of, including, honestly, this one. The difference is not whether that pull exists. It exists everywhere. The difference is whether a given piece of coverage lets that pull dictate its conclusions, or whether it does the slower, less immediately gratifying work of stating plainly where the evidence actually stops. There is a second layer to this worth naming as well, specific to cases that carry a racial justice dimension. Audiences approaching a case like this one often arrive already primed by real historical grievance, by prior cases that did resolve unjustly, to expect the worst possible version of events from the institutions involved. That primed expectation is not irrational. The Emmett Till case and the broader documented history of racial terror lynchings prove it is not irrational. But it does mean content that confirms the primed expectation travels faster and further than content that complicates it, regardless of which version is actually closer to what the evidence supports in this specific case. A creator chasing growth has a direct incentive to lean into that primed expectation rather than to interrupt it with uncomfortable nuance, even when the nuance is the more honest position. Naming that dynamic does not resolve it. But refusing to name it at all is how an entire media ecosystem ends up more confident about what happened to Nolan Wells than the board-certified forensic pathologist who actually examined his body. This is, honestly, the critical piece missing from most of what you have already watched about this case, and it is worth being direct about it rather than dancing around it. A lot of commentary treats alleged and confirmed as basically interchangeable, using whichever word happens to fit the sentence better rather than whichever word is actually accurate. A lot of commentary treats an attorney's public statement, made in the context of representing a client with an obvious interest in a particular outcome, as though it carries the same evidentiary weight as a forensic pathologist's signed report. A lot of commentary treats a private citizen's reconstructed timeline of publicly available footage, however well-intentioned, as though it were an official investigative finding rather than one interested party's interpretation of a partial record. None of those categories are inherently worthless. An attorney's statement can be true. A private timeline reconstruction can surface a real, useful lead. But they're not the same kind of evidence as a signed autopsy report, and treating them as though they were is exactly how a 2-hour gap in a timeline turns into 4 names being harassed online for a crime none of them has been charged with. Before we get to that core question, it is worth looking at this exact same undetermined ruling through 4 completely different professional lenses, because the phrase means something distinct to each of them, and conflating those meanings is another quiet way this case gets distorted in translation from the courtroom to the comment section. Look at it first as a prosecutor would. A district attorney does not have the luxury of working from suspicion, community anger, or even a compelling but unauthenticated audio clip. A prosecutor has to identify a specific person, establish a specific criminal act, and prove both beyond a reasonable doubt to a jury, using evidence that will survive cross-examination from a defense attorney whose entire job is to find every gap in that evidence and widen it. From a prosecutorial standpoint, an undetermined cause and manner of death is close to the worst possible starting point, because it does not even establish that a crime occurred, let alone who committed it. Angel Myers-McElrath cannot walk into a grand jury room and ask jurors to indict a named individual for causing a death that two credentialed medical examiners have both declined to attribute to any specific mechanism. Until the forensic picture sharpens considerably, a prosecutor's hands are not being tied by politics or cowardice. They are being tied by the actual evidentiary standard the justice system requires before it can take someone's freedom, a standard that exists precisely because the alternative, prosecuting people on the strength of public outrage alone, has its own well-documented history of producing wrongful convictions. Look at it second as a journalist committed to old-fashioned verification standards would, rather than as a commentator or reaction host. It is worth naming a recurring figure across these cases too, because his repeated presence is itself informative about how this particular category of case tends to unfold procedurally. Ben Crump has represented families in a long list of cases involving contested deaths of Black Americans, building a recognizable public template. Commission an independent autopsy from a credentialed, high-profile forensic pathologist, announce the findings at a major public venue or press conference, and pair the legal effort with sustained media visibility. That template has, in various cases over the years, preceded outcomes ranging from meaningful legal accountability to years of unresolved undetermined rulings, much like the one Kendrick Johnson's family is still living with. Recognizing the template does not tell you, on its own, which category this specific case will fall into. It does mean that some of what feels, to a first-time observer, like an unusual or uniquely dramatic sequence of events, the celebrity-funded autopsy, the NAACP convention announcement, the national media rollout, is in fact a now well-established playbook, applied consistently across many different cases with many different eventual outcomes, and understanding that it is a playbook, rather than something spontaneous and case-specific, is useful context for calibrating how much any single step in that playbook should move your own confidence about what actually happened. A journalist's job in a case like this is not to resolve the uncertainty for the audience. It is to accurately represent the size and shape of that uncertainty, sourcing every claim, attributing every allegation to whoever is making it, and being disciplined about the difference between a pathologist found and the internet believes. Judged by that standard, a meaningful share of the coverage this case has received over the past month would not pass a basic editorial fact-check, not because the underlying facts are unknowable, but because the discipline required to represent them accurately is less viscerally satisfying than the discipline required to build an audience quickly. That is not a claim that no good journalism has been done on this case, and it would be unfair to suggest otherwise. Real, careful reporting from established outlets is exactly where the confirmed timeline, the confirmed autopsy findings, and the confirmed legal statements in this piece actually came from, work that required real time, real sourcing, and real editorial discipline most viral commentary never bothers to invest. It is a claim that the loudest coverage and the most accurate coverage have not, in this case, been the same coverage, and a critical viewer has to be willing to tell the two apart. It is worth noticing, too, how differently various outlets have chosen to frame the same underlying facts, because the contrast itself is instructive. Coverage built primarily around dramatic, true crime-style presentation has tended to foreground the disputed audio clip and speculation about specific individuals, formats built for maximum emotional engagement in a short window of viewer attention. Coverage from outlets with a more traditional news and legal reporting orientation has tended to foreground the actual documented sequence of events, the specific source statements from Dr. Mitchell, from the attorneys involved, from the district attorney's office, formats built around verification even when that verification produces a less dramatic story. Both kinds of coverage are technically discussing the same case. They are not functionally telling the same story, and the gap between them is exactly where a viewer's own media literacy either holds up or gives way. Noticing which kind of outlet a given piece of information originally came from, before that information gets stripped of its sourcing and repackaged into a 30-second clip, is one of the simplest, most effective habits available for staying oriented inside a case like this one. There is also a legitimate, separate path toward accountability worth naming here, one that operates entirely outside the criminal justice system and does not require the undetermined ruling to ever resolve into a homicide finding at all. Civil litigation, a wrongful death lawsuit, for instance, operates under a lower evidentiary standard than criminal prosecution, requiring only a preponderance of the evidence rather than proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and it does not require a district attorney's office to decide the case is worth pursuing in the first place. The Kendrick Johnson family pursued exactly this path for years, and it remains an entirely available option for the Wells family regardless of what any grand jury ultimately decides. A civil verdict would not put anyone in prison. It would not require the same forensic certainty a criminal homicide charge would. But it represents a genuinely different, genuinely available mechanism for a family to seek some form of formal accountability, one worth understanding as separate from, and not dependent on, the criminal process this piece has spent most of its time examining. It is worth pausing before moving to the next lens on what actually changes for each of the people at the center of this case depending on which of those three grand jury outcomes eventually occurs, because the stakes are not symmetrical and pretending they are flatten something important. An indictment would mean a named individual faces the full weight of a criminal trial, a life-altering process regardless of its eventual verdict, and it would give the Wells family something the Johnson family has never had: a defendant, a courtroom, a forum in which the evidence finally gets tested under oath. A declined indictment or a quiet close without ever reaching a grand jury vote would mean the four friends who have already endured months of unproven public accusation continue living under an unresolved cloud of suspicion that a formal legal outcome, paradoxically, might do less to lift than an actual trial and acquittal would, because no charges were filed, reads to a skeptical public as an institution protecting someone, not as an institution accurately reflecting what the evidence
supports.
And for Christine Wells Wansley, every single one of these outcomes shares the same defining feature. None of them bring her son back, and none of them, on their own, tell her definitively what happened to him in those 2 hours, only whether the state believes it can prove it in a courtroom. Those are two different questions, easy to conflate, and only one of them is what a grand jury is actually capable of answering. Look at it third as a public health and community response question, separate entirely from the criminal question. Regardless of how the undetermined ruling eventually resolves, a Mississippi coastal community has now lived through a summer defined by a teenager's unexplained death, a national media storm, threats serious enough to produce federal and state criminal charges against multiple people, and a public nursing board investigation into a grieving mother. That is a genuine community trauma, independent of whatever the grand jury eventually does or does not decide, and it does not require a resolved criminal case to be real or to deserve a response. The march in Gulfport, the Congressional Black Caucus involvement, the funeral funded by Tyler Perry and officiated by Reverend Al Sharpton, all of that represents a community and a broader public processing genuine grief and genuine fear in real time, not simply waiting on a verdict, and reducing any of it to a footnote beneath the forensic dispute is a disservice to everyone who showed up. Treating community response purely as a subplot of the criminal investigation misses most of what has actually happened here on the ground, in Mississippi, among people who knew Nolan Wells personally and are living through this regardless of what a grand jury eventually decides. Look at it fourth, finally, as an audience psychology question, because that is the lens most true crime coverage refuses to turn on itself. Millions of people who never met Nolan Wells, never met his mother, never set foot on Horn Island, have spent weeks forming strong, confident opinions about exactly what happened to him, based overwhelmingly on secondhand video commentary rather than primary source material. That is not a character flaw specific to anyone watching this. It is a predictable response to an information environment engineered to produce exactly that outcome, an environment engineered, at every layer, from the thumbnail to the recommendation algorithm to the comment section that rewards the boldest reply with the most visibility, where confident narration is rewarded with attention and careful uncertainty is not. There is a specific cognitive mechanism worth naming directly, because understanding how it operates is more useful than simply being warned it exists. Confirmation bias, the well-documented tendency to more readily accept information that fits a belief you already hold and to scrutinize more skeptically information that challenges it, does not feel like bias from the inside. It feels like common sense, like simply recognizing what is obviously true. Someone who already distrusts the Mississippi coroner's office, for entirely defensible historical reasons, will find the missing hyoid bone instantly, viscerally convincing as evidence of wrongdoing, and will find Dr. Mitchell's own more measured characterization of that retention as standard practice easy to overlook or discount. Someone predisposed to distrust the family's advocacy, for whatever reason, will find the friend's attorney's denials immediately credible and will find the historical pattern of racial terror lynchings in Mississippi and its bearing on why this community reacted the way it did, easy to wave off as irrelevant ancient history. Both of those instincts feel from the inside like clear thinking. Neither one actually is. The only real defense against that pull is the boring, repeatable discipline this piece has tried to model throughout, naming what is confirmed, naming what is alleged, and refusing to let either instinct decide which is which for you. Recognizing that pull in yourself, noticing the moment a compelling video makes you feel certain about a fact you have not actually verified, is not a small thing. It is honestly the most transferable skill this entire case can teach you, one you will need again the next time a case like this one goes viral, because there will be a next time, there always is. That fourth lens raises an uncomfortable question the true crime genre as a whole rarely asks about itself, and it is worth asking directly rather than gesturing at it. What actually happens to a family's grief when it becomes a permanent, monetized content category, revisited by dozens of unrelated creators, argued over by millions of strangers, replayed in thumbnails long after the family themselves might prefer some measure of privacy to process what happened? There is a real, legitimate public interest in accountability, in institutional transparency, in the kind of scrutiny that, in the Lacy case, actually produced a genuine federal investigation. That legitimate interest is not the same thing as the broader ecosystem of true crime content this case has generated, an ecosystem that will keep producing videos about Nolan Wells, about Kendrick Johnson, about Lennon Lacy, about TJ Davis, indefinitely, regardless of whether their families want that attention to continue, because the content, once made, keeps generating views on its own long after the news cycle that originally justified it has passed. This piece exists inside that same ecosystem. It is not exempt from that tension simply because it is trying to be careful. The most honest thing it can do is name that tension plainly, rather than pretending the mere act of being accurate resolves the deeper ethical question of whether a family's worst month deserves to become permanent content at all. So what can medicine actually tell us, and what can it not, when a young person is found dead in or near water, days after anyone last saw them alive? This is worth answering directly and completely because it is the actual core of what this entire hour has been building toward. It can tell you, with real confidence, whether water was inhaled into the lungs at a cellular level, which is the clearest marker separating a person who is alive and breathing when they entered the water from a person who was already deceased before the water ever reached them. It can tell you about hemorrhaging in the eyes consistent with the physical strain of drowning. It can, in a fresh examination, tell you a great deal about bruising patterns, about the timing of an injury relative to death, about whether a mark on the body happened before, during, or after the heart stopped. It can, when the right structures are available and the tissue is fresh enough, distinguish a hyoid fracture consistent with strangulation from ordinary postmortem change. All of that is real, established forensic science, the product of more than a century of accumulated case study and peer-reviewed methodology, refined across countless prior cases long before this one ever existed, and none of it is in dispute as a method, only its application to specific, decomposed, incompletely preserved remains is ever genuinely in dispute. What it cannot do is retroactively restore information that time and decomposition have already erased. It cannot examine a bone that was never sent to the examiner. It cannot tell you, with certainty, what happened in a 2-hour gap on an island with no cameras, no matter how many credentialed opinions eventually weigh in on the body that gap produced. It cannot undo 6 days of Gulf Coast heat, or 3 years of institutional silence, or 13 years of a family waiting for a phone call that has never come. It cannot tell a mother, with the certainty she deserves, whether the last 2 hours of her son's life were an accident or something else entirely, and no amount of public pressure, no march, no congressional letter, no celebrity-funded second opinion can manufacture that certainty out of tissue that had already begun breaking down before anyone qualified to read it ever arrived. That is not a failure of anyone's effort. Dr. Mitchell did not fail by reaching undetermined. He reached the conclusion the evidence available to him actually supported, which is, in its own way, the single most professionally honest thing a forensic pathologist can do in a case exactly like this one, resisting the very real pressure from every direction to hand a grieving family and a watching nation a more satisfying answer than the body in front of him was actually able to give. Forensic pathology is extraordinary at reading what remains. It has no power at all over what has already been lost, to time, to decomposition, to a chain of custody decision made in the first 72 hours, for reasons that may have been entirely standard and still left a permanent gap in what anyone will ever be able to prove. There is one more piece of forensic science worth walking through here, because it comes up in nearly every water recovery case, and it directly touches the claims made in the original interview commentary about this case, some accurate, some oversimplified. Once a person has drowned, their body does not typically remain submerged indefinitely. As cellular decomposition progresses, bacteria in the gut and tissue produce gas, and that gas causes the body to become buoyant enough to rise back to the surface, a process commonly cited as beginning somewhere in the range of 24 to 72 hours after death, though the actual timeline varies considerably depending on water temperature, depth, salinity, and the individual body itself. Warmer water accelerates the process. Colder water slows it dramatically, sometimes by weeks. This is a real, well-established forensic principle, and it is one of the reasons investigators searching for a missing person near water often expand their search to the surface and shoreline after the first day or two, rather than continuing to focus exclusively underwater. Wells' body was found on the shoreline, not recovered from open water by divers, a detail consistent with this general pattern, though it does not by itself prove or disprove any particular sequence of events, and it is exactly the kind of detail that sounds significant in isolation but tells you comparatively little once you actually understand the underlying science behind it. There is also a specific forensic technique, less commonly discussed in casual commentary but genuinely used in contested drowning cases, called diatom testing. Diatoms are microscopic algae present in nearly all natural water sources, each body of water carrying its own distinct diatom signature based on local ecology. If a person drowns while alive, water containing those diatoms can, in some cases, be carried by the bloodstream into organs far from the lungs, including bone marrow, because a living, circulating body can transport them there. If a body enters water only after death, with no active circulation to carry waterborne particles beyond the immediate airway, that same distribution pattern is far less likely to appear. It is not a perfect test. Contamination and methodological limitations have made diatom testing a genuinely debated technique within forensic pathology, and it is not the kind of finding that alone resolves a case. But it represents exactly the kind of granular, physical evidence that becomes harder to gather cleanly the longer a body sits before a qualified examiner gets access to it. One more entry on the growing list of tools that 6 days of Gulf Coast heat may have already dulled before Dr. Mitchell ever had the chance to use them. It is worth asking, directly, what specific piece of evidence, if it existed and became public, would actually collapse this uncertainty in one direction or the other, because that question tends to cut through speculation faster than almost anything else. If a genuinely authenticated recording, verified through the kind of forensic audio process described earlier, with an intact and documented chain of custody, surfaced tomorrow, and clearly captured incriminating statements, that would be close to decisive, the single piece of evidence most likely to move this case out of undetermined and toward a specific criminal theory. If, instead, cell phone location data, timestamped and independently verified, placed every member of that friend group in a location and configuration inconsistent with the more sinister theories circulating online that would be close to equally decisive in the opposite direction. If a credible eyewitness, someone not already publicly aligned with either side of the case, came forward with a first-hand account of the missing 2 hours, that could reshape the entire timeline overnight. None of these things have happened yet, as far as the public record shows. All three are the kinds of evidence an actual investigation is built to surface, given enough time, which is precisely why the process, however maddening its pace feels to an audience that has already made up its mind, still matters more than any single viral clip. What would not resolve this case, no matter how viral it becomes, is another round of unauthenticated audio, another uncorroborated timeline reconstruction, another confident YouTube host explaining with total certainty what a body decomposed by 6 days of Gulf Coast heat can no longer actually prove. Recognizing the difference between the kind of evidence that could genuinely move this case forward and the kind that only moves engagement metrics forward is, at this point in the story, the single most useful skill a viewer following this case can develop, more useful, honestly, than knowing any individual fact in this entire hour. That, in turn, points toward a small, practical toolkit worth carrying into the next case like this one, because there will be a next one. When a piece of coverage makes a specific factual claim, ask whether it is attributed to a named person or institution willing to put their credibility behind it, the way Dr. Mitchell's findings are attributed to Dr. Mitchell, by name, in a report he signed. Ask whether the claim is described using the language of certainty, revealed, proves, confirms, when the underlying source material only supports the language of possibility, suggests, raises questions about, has not been ruled out. Ask who benefits from you believing a particular version of events with more confidence than the evidence currently justifies, not to assume bad faith automatically, but because the honest answer to that question is often simply the person telling you this story, because certainty performs better than doubt. And ask, whenever a case involves a named, uncharged private citizen, whether the coverage in front of you would survive that person reading it themselves, out loud, in a room with their own family. That last test alone would have prevented a meaningful share of what has circulated about this specific case since July. If you are looking for something more concrete to actually do with the concern this case understandably generates, beyond simply forming an opinion about it, there are real, constructive channels available that do not require repeating an unverified claim to feel like you are contributing something. Following verified statements directly from the district attorney's office and from Dr. Mitchell's own public updates, rather than second-hand summaries several steps removed from the source and reshaped by whoever last retold them, keeps your own understanding anchored to the actual record as it develops rather than to whatever version of it happened to travel the furthest. Supporting organizations that fund independent forensic review for families who cannot otherwise afford it addresses the structural access problem this piece spent real time on, a problem far bigger than any single case. And, simply, declining to participate in the targeting of named private individuals who have not been charged with anything is not a passive, minor choice. Given how directly the friend's own attorneys have tied documented threats to exactly that kind of pylon, declining to add to it is one of the few genuinely consequential actions available to anyone watching this case from outside Mississippi with no formal role in it at all, a small choice that costs nothing and, multiplied across an audience this large, matters considerably more than it might feel like it does from any single individual seat. That is not a satisfying place to end a story, and it was never going to be, no matter how carefully the last hour built toward it. It is, however, the honest one, and honesty has to outrank satisfaction here because the alternative, filling the undetermined space with the loudest available theory, whichever direction it points, is exactly what has already produced death threats against people who have never been charged with anything, and exactly what a corroded case archive like Kendrick Johnson's shows can calcify into a permanent, unresolved wound instead of an actual answer, 13 years and counting, with no clear sign even now of when or whether that counting will ever actually stop. For the record, stated once, plainly, as a single reference point rather than scattered across an hour of narrative, as of the most recent public reporting, Nolan Wells' cause and manner of death is officially undetermined, with findings pending presentation to a Mississippi grand jury and no charges filed against anyone. Kendrick Johnson's death remains officially ruled accidental by the state, technically an open case according to the Lowndes County Sheriff's Office, with no federal charges filed after a multi-year DOJ investigation and no one ever criminally charged. Lennon Lacy's death remains officially ruled a suicide, a conclusion the FBI's civil rights investigation did not overturn, though his family has never accepted it. Ticken Davis Jr.'s death remains officially ruled an accidental drowning, with no reopening of the investigation confirmed and no arrests made, 5 years on. 4 cases, for official rulings, arrived at by 4 different states over the span of more than a decade. Only one family has stopped actively fighting theirs in court, and even they have never stopped believing, in their own hearts, that the official record got it wrong. If a channel that actually sits in the undetermined instead of rushing past it is worth your time, this is a good moment to subscribe because we're going to keep tracking this case, along with the others we have not had time to bring in today, and the ones that have not even happened yet, all the way to whatever their actual conclusions turn out to be, whether that takes weeks or, like Kendrick Johnson's family has learned the hard way, more than a decade. Here is what we know, stated one more time, plainly, because repetition is the only honest tool available when a case refuses to give you a clean ending. An 18-year-old boy went to an island with friends and did not come home. There is a 2-hour gap in the visual record of that day that no official account has closed. 2 credentialed forensic examinations reached different levels of confidence about the same body, and neither reached a homicide finding, because neither had the physical evidence available to reach one. A specific piece of anatomy that could have answered the central question was not available to the second examiner, for reasons that are procedurally defensible and evidentially unfortunate at the same time. An audio clip that has not been authenticated is not evidence. For friends who have not been charged are not suspects, no matter how many times their names get typed into a comment section. A mother who spoke publicly about her son was investigated and cleared. And history, Kendrick Johnson's 13 years of Undetermined, Lennon Lacy's actual federal resolution that his own mother never fully accepted, T.J. Davis's 5 years of unanswered procedural questions, tells you that what happens next in this case is genuinely, honestly still unwritten, and no amount of confident narration from anyone on any platform changes that. That is not a cop-out, and it was never meant to feel like one. That is the actual epistemic state of the case, and pretending otherwise in either direction does a disservice to a family that has already lost more than any family should have to. Before the final word, think back for a moment to the 4 different lenses we walked through earlier: the prosecutor, the journalist, the community, and the audience watching from a phone hundreds or thousands of miles away, each of them looking at the exact same undetermined ruling and seeing something different inside it. Each of those 4 perspectives is going to experience whatever happens next in this case differently, and each of them is going to define resolution differently too. A prosecutor's version of resolution is a chargeable theory supported by admissible evidence. Nothing less, nothing more. A journalist's version of resolution is an accurately sourced account of whatever the process ultimately produces, delivered with the same rigor whether the outcome satisfies the audience or disappoints it. A community's version of resolution has almost nothing to do with the courtroom at all, and everything to do with whether the institutions around them, the sheriff's department, the coroner's office, the nursing board, prove over time that they can be trusted the next time a family in that community needs them. And an audience's version of resolution, the one driving most of the commentary you have already seen about this case, is often really just a craving for narrative closure, a desire for the story to end the way a story is supposed to end, with a clear antagonist held accountable, regardless of whether the actual evidence supports that particular shape. Those 4 versions of resolution are not going to arrive at the same time, and they may never all arrive at all. It is entirely possible for a grand jury to decline to indict anyone, closing the legal chapter of this case permanently, while the community's trust in Mississippi's death investigation system remains as damaged as it is today, while journalists continue documenting new details for years, and while millions of people online remain permanently convinced of a version of events the legal system was never able to substantiate. That is not a hypothetical failure state unique to this case, a strange, unlikely outcome invented for the sake of argument here. It is, roughly, exactly what has already happened with Kendrick Johnson, and it is close to what continues to sit unresolved, year after year, in Shira Davis's case in Minnesota. A legal resolution and a community's actual healing are not the same event, and treating them as though they automatically arrive together is one more way this kind of coverage sets its audience up for disappointment no matter which direction the facts eventually break, and no matter how confidently any single video, including this one, tries to tell you otherwise. If this kind of case, and every case like it's still waiting somewhere for the same treatment, deserves that same level of care, separating what's proven from what's just loud, and following it all the way through instead of stopping at the clip that gets the most views, that is exactly what this channel is built to do. So go ahead and subscribe now if you have not already, because there is more of this coming, more cases with the same shape, the same missing piece, the same family standing in the same undetermined space, and these cases deserve people who are willing to sit in that space instead of rushing past it toward whatever answer feels the most satisfying tonight.
Confirmed.
Not alleged. That has been the line running underneath everything in this case from the first minute to the last, quietly separating what actually happened from what merely felt true, and it is the only line worth holding on to once the cameras move on to the next headline. Confirmed. A timeline with a real gap in it. Confirmed. A forensic dispute neither side has definitively won. Confirmed. Real institutional response. Real threats prosecuted. Real grief that does not care whether the case ever resolves. Confirmed. A pattern, across 3 separate states and 3 separate decades, of the single most decisive piece of evidence being unavailable by the time an independent examiner arrived. Alleged, the audio. Alleged, the toxicology fabrication. Alleged, the specific friend anyone is certain did it. Alleged, certainty itself, wherever you find it in the story, because right now, certainty is the one thing nobody involved in this case has actually earned. What we know, what we don't know yet. Those 2 categories are going to keep splitting further and further apart as this case moves toward a grand jury, pulling the confirmed record and the surrounding noise in increasingly different directions, and whichever direction it eventually breaks, the honest response is going to be the same one it has always been. Read the actual findings, not the clip, not the thread, not the reconstructed timeline from a well-meaning stranger, not the theory with the most confident narrator. Read what the pathologists actually wrote. Read what the lawyers actually said on the record with their names attached. Read the parts that complicate your existing opinion just as carefully as the parts that confirm it. That is the only version of justice a case like this can actually survive contact with. Before you go, one more time, because it matters and because it is the entire reason a channel like this exists instead of just another reaction video pointed at whatever clip happens to be trending this week. Subscribe if you want cases covered this way, confirmed, separated from alleged, every time, no matter how satisfying the alternative version would be to tell. Nolan Wells' case is not closed. Kendrick Johnson's is not closed, and 13 years in, may never be. TJ Davis's is not closed, and his mother is still waiting for someone to simply ask the right questions. Lennon Lacy's is the only one of the 4 that reached a documented end, and even that ending left a family that never fully accepted it, and never had to pretend they did just because the file was marked closed. That, stripped of every clip, every theory, every confident narrator who ever stood between you and the actual record, is what these 4 cases actually have in common. Not a villain. Not a clean answer. A group of families, years and states apart from each other, still waiting for medicine and the systems built around it to finally tell them something they can trust. Notice, too, before closing this out, what these 4 cases do not have in common, because that matters just as much as the pattern connecting them. They span 2 decades. 2 of them involve dueling autopsies that never reached a 3rd round. One involves 3 separate examinations that still did not produce consensus. One involves no competing forensic opinion at all, only a mother's unanswered question about whether anyone was ever properly interviewed. They occurred in 4 different states, under 4 different coroner and medical examiner systems, prosecuted or declined by 4 entirely separate offices with no institutional connection to one another. The only thread tying them together is the one this piece has spent an hour trying to isolate carefully from everything surrounding it, pulling it out from under the clips and the theories and the confident narrators one patient paragraph at a time. A young Black person died under circumstances that could not be immediately, cleanly explained, and the process built to explain it, however well-intentioned any individual person inside that process may have been, did not move fast enough, or thoroughly enough or transparently enough to close the gap between what a family needed to know and what the evidence, by the time anyone independent got to examine it, was still actually capable of proving. Go back to where this started, because everything walked through in between: the timeline, the 2 autopsies, the missing bone, the disputed clip, the nursing board, the 4 friends who have never been charged, the march, the funeral, the 3 other families in 3 other states carrying versions of this exact same weight, was always in service of that one opening image. The only image that actually matters once the noise around it gets cleared away. A 12 by 8 inch mark on the back of an 18-year-old skull, and nobody, not the coroner, not the forensic pathologist, not the mother who buried him, agreeing on what put it there. That image has not resolved itself in the time it has taken to walk through everything else in this hour, and it is not going to resolve itself the moment this video ends either. It is still exactly what it was at the beginning: an unexplained mark on a body that decomposition and delay had already begun erasing before anyone independent got the chance to look closely enough to say for certain what it meant. That is the actual shape of this case, stripped of every theory, every clip, every confident narrator standing between you and it. An unexplained mark, a missing bone, a 2-hour gap, and a family, along with 3 other families in 3 other states, still waiting for an answer the evidence has not yet been able to give them. Until it does, the only responsible position is the one we started with, the one this entire hour was built to defend rather than to talk you out of the moment it stopped being convenient. Nobody knows. Not for certain.
Not yet.
And anyone telling you otherwise in either direction, on either side of this argument, is selling you something louder than the truth.